Hello, and welcome to Brada Tales. Tonight, we're bringing you a selection of eerie stories paired with the soothing sound of rain to help you relax and drift off to sleep. Before diving into the atmosphere of suspense, leave a comment below letting us know where you're watching from and what time it is. If these stories send chills down your spine, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Get comfortable, let the fear gradually envelop you, and tell us what kind of stories you'd like to hear next time. Settle in, we're about to begin. There's something about old houses that feels unsettling. You never know what you might find tucked away in the corners or hidden in a room you never bothered to visit. But even I, the most curious person I know, never expected to find something like this. It was just another ordinary morning. The kind where the air smells faintly of dust and fresh coffee. I was walking through the house as usual, my footsteps echoing softly through the old wooden floors. The house had always been quiet, too quiet sometimes. But that day, as I walked past the hallway leading to the back of the house, something was different. At first, I thought it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. But then I saw it. There was a new door. It wasn't there the day before. I was sure of it. I would have remembered it. It was an old wooden door, like the others in the house, but there was something strange about it. It didn't match the rest. The edges were frayed, as though it had been hastily installed. And it was too narrow, too small to fit the space it occupied. There was no handle, no keyhole. Just a smooth, plain surface. I approached it, my breath catching slightly in my throat. I placed my hand on the wood, feeling the cold surface under my palm. There was nothing unusual about it. No markings, no signs that it was anything more than a door. But that's when I heard it. A faint sound. A whisper, maybe? I couldn't tell. It was so soft, almost as if it were coming from the other side of the door. I froze, listening. The whispering stopped, but the feeling didn't go away. It lingered, like the remnants of a dream you can't quite remember. I pulled my hand back and stared at the door for a moment longer. It was almost as if it were calling to me. I shook my head, trying to dismiss the feeling. It was ridiculous. I had heard nothing. The door was nothing. It was just a door. But something inside me told me to be careful. There was a nagging feeling in the back of my mind that wouldn't let go. I didn't open it. Not then. Instead, I walked away. But as I turned down the hallway, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. The rest of the day passed uneventfully. I tried to convince myself that I was just tired, that my mind was playing tricks on me. After all, the house had always been quiet, too quiet at times, but nothing ever happened here. It was old, yes, but it had always felt like home. Safe. Secure. Still, I couldn't shake the image of the door. I tried to ignore it. I told myself I was being foolish, that the door had always been there and I just never noticed it before. Maybe the house had been rearranged at some point and I hadn't remembered. But the whisper, I kept coming back to that. The house felt different after that. The usual hum of silence had turned into a tension, like the walls were waiting for something. I could almost hear the house holding its breath, as if something was about to happen. But what? What was waiting? I went about my evening, preparing dinner in the kitchen, trying to distract myself. But I couldn't focus. Every few minutes, my eyes would drift toward the hallway, toward the door. It was around dusk when I first heard it again. The whisper. At first, it was nothing more than a murmur, so faint I could barely make it out. It was coming from the same door. I didn't want to believe it, didn't want to give in to the fear that was slowly creeping into my chest. But I couldn't ignore it. The sound was there, unmistakable. I walked slowly toward the door, heart pounding in my chest. As I neared, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. There was a faint draft coming from under the door, chilling the floorboards beneath my bare feet. The air felt heavier, denser, as if the house itself was holding its breath in anticipation. The whisper grew louder. It was a voice. Soft, like someone speaking just out of reach, but I could hear the words this time. At first, they were just fragments, too broken to make sense of. But as I stood there, frozen, the voice became clearer. Come closer. The words chilled me to the bone. I stepped back instinctively, almost tripping over my own feet. I stood there, my heart racing, my mind a whirlwind of thoughts. Was it just the wind? Maybe something outside was causing the sound? I was grasping at straws, trying to make sense of what was happening. But no! There was something about the voice that felt wrong. It wasn't natural. It didn't belong in my house. I reached for the doorknob, but stopped myself just as my hand was about to touch it. The whisper had stopped, but I could still feel it. The weight of something, watching, waiting. I backed away slowly, my legs trembling beneath me. It felt like the house itself was leaning in, listening. The rest of the night passed in a haze. I tried to sleep, but every time I closed my eyes, I could hear it again, the whisper. It was always there, just beyond the edge of my hearing, teasing me, pulling me closer. I wanted to ignore it. I wanted to forget the door, to pretend that nothing had happened. But I knew that wasn't possible. The door was calling me, and I couldn't stop myself from wanting to answer. The days blurred together after that. I tried to go about my life, but everything felt off. The house, once comforting in its quiet isolation, now felt like a prison. Every corner I turned, every room I entered, there was that unshakable sense of being watched. But the worst part was the door. It was always there, just beyond my peripheral vision, like an unwanted guest in my home. I couldn't avoid it anymore. The whispers had stopped for a while, but the silence that followed was far worse. It felt like the air itself was thick with expectation. The house, or whatever was in it, was waiting for me to make a move. That afternoon, I finally gave in. I stood in front of the door, the cold wood pressing against my palm. My breath came in shallow gasps, but I couldn't back down. Not now. Not after everything. There was something I needed to understand. I needed to know what was behind that door. The moment my hand gripped the handle, I felt it cold, freezing, as if the door itself was made of ice. I hesitated, but something inside me pushed me forward. It was like a compulsion, an invisible force drawing me in. The door creaked open with a sound that echoed too loudly in the stillness of the house, a sound that made my skin crawl. I stepped inside, and immediately, a wave of nausea hit me. The room was dark. No windows, no light. Only the faintest trace of a shadow in the farthest corner, barely discernible in the dimness. I could feel it, though. The room was wrong. The air was too thick, too still, like it had been sealed away for years. I reached for the light switch, but there was nothing. No light, no source of illumination. Only darkness. But there was something else. A presence. The air seemed heavier, more oppressive the deeper I stepped in. My feet moved slowly, uncertainly, the floorboards creaking under my weight. Every step felt like it echoed forever, each sound sharper than the last. I was aware of my own breathing now, the way it sounded too loud in the otherwise silent room. My pulse was racing, and my thoughts were jumbled. Was this really happening? Was this real? The shadows in the corner shifted. I froze. At first, it was subtle, a faint movement I thought I imagined. But then I saw it more clearly, a figure, tall and thin, standing still in the far corner of the room. It was dark, barely discernible against the blackness of the room, but I could feel its presence. It was like a cold wind that I couldn't escape, wrapping itself around me, creeping into my skin. My heart pounded in my chest, and I wanted to run. But something held me there. My feet wouldn't move. The figure didn't speak. It just stood there, watching. I couldn't make out any features, only the shape of it, tall and unnaturally still. But there was something about it that was worse than the whispers. It was the silence. The complete, unnerving stillness of it. I opened my mouth to call out, but no sound came. The air was too thick to speak, like the room itself was absorbing everything I tried to say. I wanted to leave. I knew I had to leave. But my legs felt like they were rooted to the spot, my body unwilling to obey my mind. My eyes stayed locked on the figure in the corner, waiting for it to move, to do something. But it didn't. It just stood there, in the shadows, its shape barely perceptible in the darkness. I thought I saw something shift, its head tilting slowly toward me. And then, without warning, it moved. The figure glided toward me, impossibly fast, covering the space between us in a blink. The cold rushed at me, and I felt it deep in my bones, like ice water had been poured over my body. My heart slammed in my chest. My legs gave out beneath me. I collapsed to the floor, gasping for air, but there was no breath. The silence was suffocating, like it was swallowing me whole. I couldn't move. I couldn't even scream. The figure stopped just in front of me. It was closer than I thought, its face, if it had one, still hidden in the shadows. But I could feel it. It was watching me, studying me. Its presence felt like it was seeping into my very soul. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, it was gone. The room was empty again. The shadows were still. The air was still thick, but the figure was no longer there. I could hear my own breathing now, ragged and shallow. I scrambled to my feet, hands shaking. I didn't want to look back, but I had to. I turned slowly, expecting to see the figure standing behind me, but there was nothing. I bolted from the room, slamming the door behind me. As soon as the door clicked shut, the silence descended again. The house was as it had always been, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me back. I stood there, heart pounding, in the middle of the hallway, trying to steady my breathing. But I couldn't. The silence had returned, yes. But it wasn't the same. There was something different now. The air felt heavier. And the whispers, the ones I had thought were just in my head, started again. Louder this time. Clearer. But now, it wasn't just a voice. It was a demand. Come back, it said. Come back to the door. I didn't want to. I didn't want to go anywhere near that door again. But I knew, deep down, that I would. The house was waiting for me to return. Waiting for me to open the door once more. And this time, I wasn't sure I would make it out. I couldn't breathe. My chest felt tight, like a weight was pressing down on it. The whispers had started again, but they weren't just whispers now. They were insistent, urgent, calling me, pulling me toward the door. I could feel it in my bones. Something was waiting for me behind it. Something hungry. I stood there in the hallway, my back pressed against the wall, trying to steady myself. My legs felt like jelly, and my mind was a swirling mess of panic and confusion. I wanted to run, to get out of the house, to leave it all behind. But I knew I couldn't. I could already feel the pull of the door, the way it seemed to reach out to me, beckoning me like an old friend I couldn't forget. The air around me grew colder, and I could see my breath in front of me, even though the house was warm. The chill crept into my skin, wrapping around my bones, freezing me in place. Then I heard it. A low, guttural sound, barely a murmur at first, but then it grew louder, like something moving in the darkness, shifting, breathing. I couldn't ignore it any longer. I had to go back to the door. My feet moved on their own, as if they had a mind of their own. I didn't want to do this. I didn't want to face whatever lay behind it. But I couldn't stop myself. It was like I was being controlled, like something was pulling the strings inside me. I walked down the hallway, my footsteps echoing too loudly in the silence. The closer I got to the door, the heavier the air became. It felt thick, suffocating, like the very walls of the house were closing in on me. When I reached the door, I stopped. My hand hovered over the cold surface. The whispers grew louder, no longer faint. They were all around me now, a chorus of voices, all calling my name. They were almost melodic, as if they were singing to me, coaxing me to open the door. I wanted to turn around, to run away, but something stopped me. The house had me in its grip now. It knew that I would open it. With trembling hands, I grabbed the door handle and turned. The door creaked open, just like it had before, and the cold hit me again, an unnatural chill that seemed to seep into my skin. I stepped inside, and the darkness swallowed me whole. I couldn't see anything. It was pitch black, not a single sliver of light to guide me. My heart pounded in my chest, and I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. The air was thick, damp, like I had stepped into a tomb. And then I heard it. A sound so soft, so faint, it made my skin crawl. It was a whisper, but this time it wasn't just one voice. It was dozens of voices, all murmuring at once, overlapping, blending into something incomprehensible. I wanted to scream, to run, but my feet wouldn't move. I stood frozen in the darkness, straining to hear, to understand. There was something in here with me. I could feel it moving, just beyond my reach. The faintest rustle, a shadow shifting in the corner of my eye. And then I saw it. A figure. Tall, thin, and twisted, it emerged from the darkness, moving silently toward me. Its body was misshapen, like it didn't quite belong in the world. The edges of its form seemed to flicker, as though it were made of smoke, constantly shifting and changing. But the face was the worst part. It wasn't human. It was a mask of twisted flesh, barely resembling a face at all. The eyes were hollow, black pits that seemed to swallow any light that dared to touch them. Its mouth was a jagged slit, stretching unnaturally wide, and when it opened, I heard a sound that made my stomach turn, a low, guttural hiss, like something scraping against metal. I tried to move, to run, but my legs were paralyzed, my body frozen in place. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't scream. I was trapped. The figure inched closer, its hollow eyes fixed on me, as if it were studying me, deciding whether I was worth devouring. The air grew colder, if that was even possible, and I felt something cold and wet brush against my skin, like fingers that didn't belong. "Why did you come back?" the figure whispered. Its voice was both everywhere and nowhere, 1,000 voices speaking at once. I didn't answer. I couldn't. The figure stepped closer, its form becoming clearer with each passing second. I could see its limbs now, long, unnaturally thin, bending at impossible angles. Its fingers were tipped with claws, sharp and glistening like black knives. I had to get out. I had to escape. But the figure reached out, its hand moving toward me with terrifying speed. I felt its cold touch on my arm, and in that instant, everything went silent. The whispers stopped. The house stopped breathing. For a second, I thought I had died. Then, with a force that took me by surprise, I broke free. I ran. I didn't look back. I just ran, my feet pounding against the floor, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I didn't stop until I was out of the room, out of the house, standing in the cold night air. But even then, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still with me. I looked back at the house, and in the distance, I swore I saw something in the window. A figure. Watching me. The door was still open. And I knew, deep down, that it would always be there. Calling me back. The house wasn't done with me. It would never be done. And neither was I. The night air felt bitter against my skin, cold enough to bite through my jacket, but I hardly noticed. My breath came in heavy, ragged gasps, my body trembling uncontrollably. My feet, though, moved on their own, carrying me away from the house. The shadows of the trees seemed to stretch toward me as if they were reaching for something, urging me to run farther, faster. But I couldn't stop. I didn't dare stop. I didn't look back. Not at first. I couldn't. But as I reached the edge of the property, the whispers began again. Soft at first, like a hum in the back of my mind, but then louder, clearer. It was the same voice, the same chorus of voices I'd heard before, but this time it was not just in my head. It was everywhere. It echoed from the house, from the trees, from the air itself. And it wasn't just whispering anymore. It was calling my name. "Come back," it said, and this time there was no mistaking the urgency, the hunger in the voice. It was calling to me like a siren's song, pulling me back to the door, to the darkness. I tried to block it out, tried to focus on the sound of my own heartbeat, the rush of blood in my ears. But the whispers only grew louder, more insistent. It was as if the house was alive, breathing with me, calling me, reminding me that no matter how far I ran, it would always find me. And I knew, deep down, that I couldn't escape it. That thing behind the door, it wasn't just a figment of my imagination. It was real. I had opened the door. And in doing so, I had invited something into my life that would never let me go. I stumbled back toward the house, my body moving as if it were no longer under my control. My mind screamed at me to turn around, to run away, but my feet kept carrying me forward. The whispers were too loud now. I could hear them in my bones, feel them under my skin. It was like they were in the air itself, wrapping around me like a heavy, suffocating fog. The house loomed in front of me, its windows dark and empty, but I could feel it watching. The door, that cursed door, stood open, inviting me back inside. I could almost see it in the darkness, a faint outline against the black sky. I reached the front step and paused. The door was open, but this time I hesitated. I wasn't sure if I was ready to face whatever lay beyond it. The house felt different now, more alive, more aware. The silence had returned, but it wasn't comforting. It was oppressive, like a heavy weight pressing down on my chest. I could feel the presence behind the door, like a living thing, waiting for me to open it again. I took a step toward it, my hand trembling as I reached for the handle. The cold that radiated from it was unbearable, colder than anything I had ever felt. My skin burned with the chill, and I could hear my heart pounding in my ears. Every instinct screamed at me to turn and run, but I couldn't. I had to know. I twisted the handle and pushed the door open. The darkness inside was suffocating, thick as tar. I stepped inside, my mind screaming at me to turn back, but my feet carried me deeper, deeper into the shadowed room. The cold surrounded me, the air growing even heavier with each step. I was back. I wanted to scream, but the words wouldn't come. The silence had returned, but it wasn't the same. The air was thick with anticipation. I could feel the house breathing, waiting for something. Waiting for me. The figure was there again, standing in the corner, watching me with those hollow eyes. I couldn't make out its features, but I could feel it. It was closer this time. I could hear it moving in the darkness, its limbs shifting, twisting, as if it were made of something unnatural, something that didn't belong. It moved toward me slowly, silently, its form flickering in and out of the darkness. I could hear it now, a low hiss, like a breath drawn in from the very depths of the earth. I couldn't move. I couldn't even breathe. And then, a voice. Not the whispering voices from before, but one clear voice. It wasn't loud, but it wasn't a whisper either. It was as if the voice was inside my mind, speaking directly to me. You came back. The words echoed in my skull, vibrating against my bones. I felt them in my chest, deep in my gut, like the weight of the house itself was pressing on me. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run. But my legs wouldn't move. I was rooted to the spot, trapped in the dark. The figure stepped closer, its face still obscured by shadow. But there was something else now. Something new. The air in the room seemed to shift, vibrating with an energy I couldn't understand. The darkness around me felt alive, pressing in from all sides. It wasn't just the room that was closing in on me, it was the entire house. You opened the door, the voice said again, more insistent now, almost accusatory. Now you belong to us. The words struck me like a physical blow. I could feel the weight of them, the truth behind them, sinking into my soul. I wasn't just a visitor here. I wasn't just someone who had stumbled across something they shouldn't have. I had invited this thing into my life. I had opened the door. And now, there was no escaping it. The figure reached out a hand, its fingers long and twisted, like branches of a dead tree. It hovered just in front of my face, and I could feel its icy coldness, the chill that radiated from it. It wasn't just cold, this was something deeper, something older than anything I had ever felt. Now you will stay, it whispered, its voice wrapping around me like chains. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. The house had me, body and soul. There was no escape. And then, the door slammed shut behind me. The world went black. But in the darkness, I could still hear it, the whispers. Louder now. They were no longer distant. They were all around me, and the house was waiting. It started with a question, one that seemed too simple to matter. Did you hear that? At first, I thought I was losing my mind. I'd ask my friends, my family, but they would just shake their heads. No, we didn't hear anything. They'd laugh it off, thinking I was being dramatic. But I wasn't. I wasn't imagining it. The first time it happened, I was alone in my apartment. It was late, the kind of late when the world feels quiet, like everyone else is asleep, leaving you alone with your thoughts. I sat in my favorite armchair, reading a book, the only sound the soft rustle of pages turning and the hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. And then I heard it. A faint whisper, like the wind catching on the edge of a door. But there was no wind. Come closer, the voice whispered, so softly, I almost thought I imagined it. I froze, looking around the room. There was no one there. The apartment was as empty as it always was. I shook my head, dismissing it as a trick of the mind, some leftover noise from the outside world. But the whispering didn't stop. It came again, clearer this time. Sarah. My name. It was my name. But who was calling me? The sound was close, too close. It felt like someone was standing right behind me. I spun around, my heart racing, but the room was empty. Just the walls, the chair, the soft glow of the lamp beside me. I told myself it was nothing. I was just tired. My mind was playing tricks on me. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The next few days, it happened again. But this time, it was while I was in bed, the covers pulled tightly around me. I woke up in the middle of the night, heart pounding, a cold sweat drenching my skin. I lay still, listening to the silence. It was the kind of silence that presses against your ears, making you feel like you're the only person in the world. And then I heard it. A whisper. Barely audible, but distinct. Sarah, don't turn around. My stomach dropped. My breath hitched in my throat. I didn't turn around. I couldn't. The voice was too close. It was right there, just behind me. The air felt heavier, like something was watching me. But when I gathered the courage to look, nothing was there. Just the dark corners of my room, silent and empty. I told myself I was imagining it. I had to be. I'd been under stress lately, juggling work and personal life, trying to make sense of everything. Maybe it was all just my mind playing tricks on me. But I couldn't ignore the feeling that something was following me, something just out of sight. It was always there, lurking, waiting. I tried to ignore it. I really did. I went about my days, pretending like everything was fine, that I was just tired, just stressed. But then it came again. This time, in broad daylight. I was in the kitchen, making coffee, the aroma of freshly brewed beans filling the air. The sun streamed in through the window, casting long shadows across the floor. It was a peaceful morning. Nothing unusual. And then I heard it. The whisper. Sarah, it's too late. This time, the voice wasn't just close. It was behind me. I could feel it, like someone was standing right there, just inches away. I turned quickly, heart racing, but the kitchen was empty. Just the kettle boiling, the quiet hum of the refrigerator. I wanted to scream, to demand an answer, but no words came out. My mouth was dry. I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand up, the room closing in around me. I tried to tell myself that it was nothing. Maybe it was my imagination running wild, or the sound of the house settling. But I knew deep down that this was something more. It felt different. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to every creak, every rustle. The apartment felt too big, too empty, and the silence felt wrong. It pressed down on me, suffocating me. And then I heard it again. The whisper. "Sarah, you shouldn't have come here." I froze. The voice was more distinct now, clearer than ever. It wasn't just a whisper, it was a voice, a real voice, one that carried with it an unmistakable sense of warning. I was terrified. My heart pounded in my chest, my body paralyzed with fear. I wanted to call out, to ask who it was, but my voice wouldn't work. I felt my body tense as I waited, hoping that it was just a dream, that I would wake up, that everything would be normal. But it wasn't a dream. The voice came again, colder now. "Leave before it's too late." And then, just as quickly as it had come, it stopped. The silence was deafening. My own breathing was the only sound I could hear. I had to get out. I had to leave. But where would I go? I was alone. I was always alone. The voice seemed to follow me wherever I went, lurking just behind me, waiting for me to turn around. I didn't know who, what, was speaking to me, or why. But one thing was clear, it was real. And it wasn't going to stop. The voice behind me was only just beginning. The morning after the whisper came again, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I tried to push it aside. I told myself it was just stress. I'd been working too hard, barely sleeping, my thoughts tangled in a mess of deadlines and unanswered emails. But that voice, it lingered in my mind, echoing in the silence. I went to work, mechanically going through the motions of the day. But it was as though I was on autopilot, my body moving while my mind remained trapped in that moment, the voice behind me, the cold warning, and the heavy air that seemed to follow me everywhere. Every step I took, I kept checking over my shoulder, expecting to see someone there. But there was never anyone. No one ever spoke to me, except for the voice. At lunch, I met with my friend Lisa. She noticed something was off the moment I sat down. I tried to act normal, but she could see through me. "Sarah, what's going on?" she asked, looking at me with concern. "You look pale." I forced a smile. "Nothing. Just tired, I guess." But Lisa didn't buy it. "You sure? You've been acting strange for days now. You're jumpy, like you're looking over your shoulder." I opened my mouth to brush it off, but then I hesitated. Could I really tell her about the voice? The whispers that followed me, the constant feeling that I was being watched. What if she thought I was crazy? Instead, I just shook my head. "It's nothing, really. Just work stuff. I'll be fine." But even as I said it, I didn't believe myself. The rest of the day passed in a blur. I could hardly concentrate on anything. The voice was always there, like a soft hum at the back of my mind, waiting to break through at any moment. That evening, I returned to my apartment, feeling the weight of exhaustion press down on me. But as soon as I stepped through the door, the air felt different, thicker, colder. The silence was suffocating. I dropped my bag by the door, my fingers trembling as I closed it behind me. I glanced around, half expecting to see something lurking in the shadows. But the apartment was the same as always, quiet, still. I told myself it was nothing. I told myself I was just being paranoid. But then, I heard it again. A whisper, so quiet at first that I almost didn't catch it. Sarah. It wasn't just the voice I'd heard before. This time, it was different, closer, more urgent, like the voice was in the room with me, just behind me. I froze. My heart skipped a beat. I tried to turn, but my body felt like it was made of stone. I couldn't move. The air was thick with tension, as if the very walls were holding their breath. Sarah, you shouldn't stay here. I spun around, my pulse racing. But the apartment was empty. The walls, the furniture, everything was where it should be. But the feeling didn't go away. I could still sense something unseen, watching me. I slowly walked to the kitchen, hoping to shake off the dread that had settled in my chest. But even as I poured myself a glass of water, I felt it, the heavy, suffocating presence just beyond the corner of my eye. I glanced quickly over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone standing there. But there was no one. I swallowed hard, trying to steady my breath. I had to focus. This was ridiculous. There was nothing here. Nothing but the quiet hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of traffic outside. But then, from the corner of the room, I saw it. A shadow. It wasn't quite right, too still, too dark for this part of the apartment. It shifted slightly, as if moving, but when I blinked, it was gone. My breath caught in my throat. My heart was pounding, and my hands were clammy. I quickly turned away, trying to push the image out of my mind. I tried to calm myself. It's nothing, I whispered, more to myself than anyone else. Just my imagination. But I knew it wasn't. Something was in here with me, and it wasn't going to stop. I spent the next few hours pacing around my apartment, trying to keep busy. But every time I passed by a corner or a doorway, I felt that prickling sensation at the back of my neck, like someone was watching me. I could hear the whispers, too, so faint at first, like the wind slipping through cracks in the window, but then they grew louder. Sarah, it's waiting for you. I froze, the glass I was holding nearly slipping from my fingers. I turned around, every muscle in my body tense, but there was nothing. Only the empty space in front of me, mocking me. The voice was always there now. It was becoming a constant presence in my life, lingering like an uninvited guest, and no matter how much I tried to ignore it, I couldn't. I felt trapped. Trapped in my own home, in my own mind. The phone rang, breaking the silence. I jumped, startled. I picked it up without checking the caller ID. Hello? My voice came out shakier than I intended. Sarah? It's Lisa, she said. I don't know. I have a feeling you should be careful. I don't want to scare you, but I keep having this weird dream about you, and it's unsettling. My blood ran cold. What kind of dream? Lisa hesitated, and I could hear the unease in her voice. It's about this voice. And it's calling your name. It's coming from behind you, and it's warning you about something, but I can't remember what. Just be careful, okay? My mouth went dry. I didn't know how to respond. Lisa, but the line went dead. The call ended abruptly, the silence ringing in my ears. I looked around, my heart racing. I wanted to call her back, to ask her what she meant, but I couldn't. Something in the pit of my stomach told me that whatever was happening, whatever was watching me, had just gotten worse. The voice was closer now, and I was running out of time. I spent the rest of the night in a haze, my mind racing with thoughts I couldn't quiet. The voice was getting closer, its whispers persistent, constant, always there, like a shadow that I couldn't escape. I tried to sleep, but sleep was a cruel enemy, slipping away every time I closed my eyes. The darkness in the room felt suffocating. Every creak of the floorboards, every shift of air, felt like it was a step closer to something I couldn't see. Around midnight, I thought I heard it again, faint at first, but unmistakable. The whisper of my name, curling around my consciousness like smoke. It was close, too close. I bolted upright in bed, my heart thudding in my chest. I turned toward the sound, my breath shallow, my eyes searching the corners of the room, but there was nothing there. The apartment felt wrong, distorted somehow, like the walls were closing in. The familiar surroundings had become unfamiliar, like a distorted mirror reflecting my worst fears. The stillness was crushing, the air dense with tension, as if the space itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I got up, my legs shaky, and walked to the living room. The overhead light flickered as I entered, casting long shadows that twisted unnaturally along the walls. The room felt cold, colder than it should have been for the middle of summer. I glanced toward the kitchen, the hallway, everywhere, just to make sure there was no one there, watching. But there was something else now, something I couldn't ignore. A sensation that gnawed at my gut, a prickling on the back of my neck that wouldn't go away. The whisper came again, louder this time. "Sarah, you don't belong here." It was so clear, so sharp, as if the voice was right behind me, breathing down my neck. I spun around, but again, there was no one. The air felt thick, like it was pressing in on me, and I felt a sudden, overwhelming urge to get out of the apartment, to escape whatever it was that was following me. But my legs were frozen, as if some invisible force had gripped me in place. I had to leave. I had to get out. I turned toward the door, my hands trembling as I reached for the handle. But before I could open it, something stopped me. A cold wind brushed across my face, though the windows were closed. The light flickered again, and for just a moment, I saw it. A figure, standing in the hallway, barely visible in the dim light. It was tall, cloaked in shadow, but I could see the outline of its form. Its head was tilted slightly, as if studying me. I could feel its eyes, even though I couldn't see them. My breath caught in my throat, and I stepped back, my heart pounding in my chest. "Sarah," the voice whispered again, but this time it was no longer distant. It was right next to me, in my ear, as if the figure was speaking directly into my mind. "You've been warned." I didn't wait. I couldn't. I ran toward the door, throwing it open, stumbling out into the hallway of my building. The cold air outside hit me like a shock, but it didn't help. The fear still clung to me, suffocating, unrelenting. I started walking down the stairs, trying to clear my head, trying to make sense of what had just happened. But the further I went, the more it felt like the building was stretching, warping. The walls felt like they were pressing in, like they were shifting around me. The hallway stretched endlessly, and I could still hear the voice behind me, growing louder with every step. "Sarah, don't run." I couldn't shake the feeling that something was closing in on me. I could feel it, right behind me, breathing down my neck. I turned around, but the hallway was empty. There was no one there. No figure, no shadow, just the quiet hum of the building's old pipes and the faint sound of my own breathing. I kept moving, faster now, trying to escape the suffocating atmosphere that seemed to be pulling me in. But when I reached the lobby, I hesitated. The air in the lobby was just as cold as in my apartment, and the same sense of unease washed over me. The door to the outside seemed miles away, like it was mocking me with its distance. And then, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The door was cracked open, just a sliver. A figure stood in the doorway, but it wasn't human. The shape was wrong, too tall, too thin, its features indistinct, almost blending with the shadows. The moment I saw it, I froze. My heart hammered in my chest. The voice came again, this time not in a whisper, but a harsh, guttural tone. "Leave now, before it's too late." I couldn't speak. I couldn't breathe. I just stood there, staring at the figure, my mind racing, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The figure didn't move, didn't speak. It just stood there, as if waiting for me to make the next move. I could feel the cold air surrounding me, the weight of the silence pressing in, as if the very room itself was holding its breath. "Leave," the voice said again, more insistent this time. I didn't think. I didn't process. I just ran. I bolted toward the door, pushing it open with all my strength, and as soon as I stepped outside, the weight lifted. The air felt lighter, but it was still cold. I didn't stop running. I couldn't. I just kept moving, away from the building, away from whatever that thing was. I ran until my legs burned, until the cold air stung my lungs, until I could no longer hear the voice or feel the presence following me. But even then, the fear didn't fade. I knew, deep down, that I wasn't free. The voice wasn't gone. It had only paused. And I knew it would find me again. I didn't go home that night. I couldn't. The thought of stepping back into my apartment, into that building where the shadows seemed to stretch and breathe, filled me with dread. I wandered the streets aimlessly, my mind a whirl of confusion, exhaustion, and terror. The cold night air did little to calm the storm inside me. Every step I took felt as though I was walking deeper into something I couldn't understand, something I had no control over. It was close to dawn when I found myself standing in front of a small, all-night cafe. I wasn't hungry. I wasn't thirsty. I just needed a place to sit, a moment to breathe, and perhaps for a sliver of normality to slip through the cracks of my panic. The cafe was nearly empty. Only the soft hum of the coffee machine and the occasional clink of a spoon broke the silence. I sat at a small table in the corner, trying to steady my hands, which still trembled. My reflection in the window stared back at me, pale and hollow-eyed. I looked like a stranger to myself, someone who had seen too much. But it wasn't over. I knew it wasn't over. I hadn't been able to shake the feeling that something was watching me, waiting for me to let my guard down. The cafe, once a refuge, now felt like a prison, the walls too close, the floor too hard beneath my feet. The air was thick with the same tension I'd felt in the apartment, like something invisible was pressing against me, watching me from the edges of my vision. And then, there it was again. The voice. "Sarah." It wasn't the same soft whisper I'd heard in the apartment. No, this time, the voice was clear, undeniable, and it came from behind me. I jerked around, but there was no one there. The seat opposite me remained empty. I could feel the weight of the silence pressing in, the hum of the fluorescent lights above making my head ache. "Sarah, don't run." The voice was closer now, almost in my ear. "It's already too late." I froze, my breath caught in my throat. The words were more forceful this time, more urgent. My eyes scanned the room, searching for the source, but there was nothing, only the quiet, still emptiness. But I knew, deep down, that the voice wasn't coming from anyone in the cafe. It wasn't a person. It was something else. Something not human. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end as the atmosphere in the room shifted, the shadows in the corners seeming to grow deeper, darker. I could feel the space around me warping, bending. The floor beneath me seemed to pulse, like the building itself was alive, shifting in response to the voice. I had to leave. I couldn't stay here. But the door felt miles away, the cafe suddenly vast and endless. I stood up too quickly, knocking over my cup, spilling the lukewarm coffee across the table. My heart was pounding, my mind racing, my hands clammy with sweat. I needed to get out of there. As I moved toward the door, my foot caught on the leg of a chair, sending me stumbling forward. But before I could catch myself, the voice came again, not in a whisper, but a sharp command echoing in my head. Stop. I froze, my body seizing as if it had been struck. I turned to face the source of the voice, but there was no one, only the empty room behind me. The cafe had grown quiet, the normal hum of background noise fading into nothing. Why are you running? The voice was soft now, almost gentle, but there was something cold in its tone. Something that made my stomach churn. I didn't answer. I couldn't. I didn't want to acknowledge it. I didn't want to give it power. I pushed through the door, stepping into the cold morning air. The city was eerily quiet, the streets empty, as though the world had stopped in its tracks, waiting. I pulled my jacket tighter around me, the chill seeping through the fabric, but it wasn't the cold that made my skin crawl. It was the feeling that I wasn't alone, that the voice had followed me out of the cafe and was now hovering just behind me, watching, waiting. I hurried down the sidewalk, my footsteps echoing too loudly in the silence. I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see a figure trailing behind me, but there was nothing. Nothing but the empty street, the faint glow of streetlights, and the growing dread in the pit of my stomach. I knew I couldn't keep running. The voice was everywhere now, following me like a shadow I couldn't escape. It was relentless. And no matter how fast I moved, it seemed to be just behind me, always a step away, always a breath away from catching up. I didn't stop. I couldn't. I just kept walking, pushing through the numbness that was spreading through my limbs, the terror that was clawing at my chest. And then, as I turned the corner onto a quieter street, I saw it. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, something in the shadows, a trick of my mind. But then, I saw it clearly. The figure. Tall, thin, hunched slightly, standing in the distance at the end of the street. Its features were indistinct, blending with the darkness, but I could see the shape of it, its long, spindly limbs, the way it moved, as if it was part of the night itself. The voice came again, this time a soft whisper, but I could hear the malice behind it. Come to me, Sarah. I stood frozen, unable to look away. I could feel its eyes on me, even though I couldn't see them. I could feel its presence, suffocating, cold. And then, before I could react, it moved. It wasn't a walk. It wasn't a run. It was something in between, unnatural, fluid, like it was sliding through the air toward me, faster than it should have been. I turned and ran, my legs pumping beneath me, my heart in my throat. The streets blurred around me, the world spinning, but I could hear it, the soft, sickening sound of its approach. Sarah, you can't escape. And then, the silence. I ran. My breath was ragged, my lungs burning as the chill of the night air sliced through my skin. My feet pounded against the pavement, but it felt as though I wasn't getting anywhere. No matter how fast I ran, no matter how far I tried to push myself, the sound of that thing, whatever it was getting closer. The voice, once distant, now felt like it was inside my head, whispering dark promises in a voice too close to my ear. Sarah, you can't outrun me. It wasn't just a voice anymore. It had become a presence, wrapping around me like a tightening noose, squeezing the air from my lungs. It was suffocating, overwhelming. I glanced over my shoulder for just a moment, just long enough to see it again. That thing. It was closer now, moving with unnerving speed, its limbs twisting unnaturally, its shape rippling like smoke. I couldn't make out its features, but I could feel its eyes on me. It was watching me, studying me, like I was a prey, cornered and helpless. Please. My own voice came out in a hoarse whisper, but it felt weak, useless against the weight of the terror crushing me. Please, just leave me alone. It didn't answer. The only thing that answered was the sickening sound of its approach, the soft scraping of its limbs against the ground, like the dragging of a broken body, too fragile, too wrong. I could hear the wind rushing past my ears, my heart beating so loud I feared it would explode. I stumbled forward, my legs trembling, my vision blurry. The streets were unfamiliar now, the darkness swallowing the familiar buildings around me. Everything had changed. The city, once bustling, now felt like an empty, desolate wasteland, devoid of life, of hope. And then, I heard it. The sound of its feet, or whatever they were, touching the ground behind me. It wasn't a footstep. It was the softest, sickliest noise, like the scrape of bone against stone, too wet, too unnatural. I glanced over my shoulder again, and this time, I saw it clearly. It wasn't moving anymore. It was standing still, in the middle of the street, its body unnaturally still, its head cocked to one side like it was studying me. It was waiting. Turn around, it said, its voice thick with menace. Look at me. I didn't want to. I couldn't. But there was something in the voice that pulled at me, something that twisted my insides and forced me to obey. I turned. For a split second, I thought I saw something resembling a face, a twisted, warped reflection of a human face, distorted beyond recognition. Its skin was pale, stretched tight over bones that shouldn't have been visible. The eyes, if they were eyes, were black holes, empty and endless, and they stared at me with an intensity that made my heart stutter in my chest. Why are you running, Sarah? It asked, the words slow, deliberate, dripping with something cruel. You know it's already too late. My mind was screaming at me to run, to escape, to do anything but stand there, but my body wouldn't listen. It felt like I was frozen in place, caught in the web of its gaze. The world around me was narrowing, the streets closing in, the air growing heavier with every passing second. You've always known, haven't you? The voice said, a twisted smile playing across its lips, if those things could smile. This is your fate. You can't escape what you are. You can't outrun me. The words burrowed into my mind like parasites, gnawing at my thoughts, pulling apart the fragile threads of my sanity. I wanted to scream, to break free, but the fear, it was so much more powerful than anything I had ever felt. Suddenly, the world around me snapped back into focus, and I could move again. My feet were no longer frozen to the pavement. I turned and ran harder than I had ever run before, my body screaming for release, for escape. But as I ran, the city felt like it was shifting beneath me. The streets that should have been familiar now twisted and distorted, like they were warping and folding into themselves. I wasn't running on solid ground anymore. It felt as if I was moving through a dream, no, a nightmare. The buildings around me were leaning, their windows dark and empty. The streetlights flickered, casting long, erratic shadows that seemed to reach for me like hands that wanted to drag me into the abyss. And then, the voice. It was there again, close, too close. "You're not going anywhere, Sarah." I couldn't outrun it. I couldn't escape it. The voice, the presence, they were everywhere. No matter where I turned, no matter how fast I ran, I felt it closing in on me. It was inevitable. It was already inside me. I stumbled into an alley, desperate, panicked, but it didn't help. The walls seemed to close in, the air too thick to breathe. And then, through the darkness, I saw something I hadn't noticed before, an open door just at the end of the alley. I didn't hesitate. I ran toward it, my heart racing, my lungs burning. The door was a beacon, a possibility of safety. But as I reached for the handle, I heard it again, that voice, right behind me. This time, it wasn't whispering. It was laughing. "You think you can escape?" I froze, my hand inches from the door. I didn't turn. I couldn't. But the voice, now louder, sharper, spoke one last time. "Welcome home, Sarah." And in that moment, I knew. It had always been watching. It had always been waiting. And I had walked right into its trap. It started with something small. Something I could have easily brushed off as just a trick of the light or a bad night's sleep. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. One evening, as I was getting ready for bed, I glanced into the bathroom mirror. I had just washed my face, the water still dripping down my chin, and as I wiped it away, I noticed my reflection lingered a moment longer than it should have. It wasn't anything too alarming, not at first. It wasn't like the reflection had moved on its own. No, that would have been far too obvious. But there was something in the way it stayed still, just for an extra second. Like it was waiting for something. Like it was watching me. I remember the feeling that washed over me then, a cold, creeping unease that settled deep into my stomach. I told myself it was nothing. I laughed at the thought. "It's just exhaustion," I muttered to myself. But then it happened again the next day. I was standing in front of the mirror, brushing my teeth, and as I was about to spit into the sink, I saw my reflection do something I wasn't expecting. It smiled. It didn't just mimic the movement of my lips, as it should have. No, it widened its mouth just a little too much. A little too wide. A smile that wasn't mine. My heart skipped a beat. I spat quickly, wiping my mouth with the back of my hand, and when I looked back up, my reflection was normal again. I shook my head, trying to dismiss it. Just the lighting. "I'm tired," I told myself again, trying to convince my rattled mind that there was no reason to be afraid. But then, I noticed something else. The reflection wasn't always synchronized with me. One afternoon, while getting dressed, I caught a glimpse of my reflection out of the corner of my eye. It didn't move when I did. It was just standing there, staring at me, unmoving, unblinking. I froze. My hand, mid-buttoning my shirt, trembled slightly. The reflection didn't mimic my movements right away. It was a second late. It was as if it was watching me. I turned quickly to face the mirror fully, my heart racing. There was nothing strange about the image I saw then, but the unease in my chest refused to leave. Over the next few days, the strange occurrences continued. Little things. My reflection didn't always match my gestures perfectly. Sometimes it would blink when I didn't, or look away from me when I was staring straight ahead. At one point, it even seemed to nod when I was shaking my head. The worst, however, came one evening when I leaned in close to the mirror to inspect something on my face. That's when it happened. The reflection winked at me. I froze in place. I hadn't moved, hadn't even thought to wink. I just stared at the reflection, my body too paralyzed with fear to pull away. There was no mistaking it, it was deliberate. It was an unmistakable, intentional wink. My mind raced. I backed away from the mirror, feeling the cold sweat trickle down my back. My pulse quickened, my breathing shallow. It's just my mind playing tricks on me, I muttered aloud, trying to steady myself. But something deep inside me knew this wasn't normal. I could feel it, an unshakable sense that the reflection wasn't just reflecting. It was aware. It knew I was watching. I wasn't sure what to do. Should I tell someone? Would anyone believe me? Would they think I was insane? I couldn't take my eyes off the mirror. Even now, sitting here writing this, I feel its pull, like it's watching me, just waiting for the right moment to do something more. I wish I could say I'm imagining it. But the more I look, the more I realize I am not alone in that mirror. And whatever it is, it's waiting for me to make a mistake. The days after the wink felt longer. Every time I walked past the bathroom mirror, I felt a strange pull. My eyes would dart over, and for a brief moment, I'd catch myself staring, waiting for something, anything, to happen. But the reflection remained still, as it should. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling. I wasn't just imagining things. I had seen it wink. It was real. I tried to ignore it, tell myself that I was just being paranoid, but the unease gnawed at me, relentless. At work, I couldn't focus. The thought of the mirror kept creeping into my mind, ruining even the most mundane tasks. When I went to the kitchen at lunch, I would check the time on my phone instead of looking at the reflection in the office windows. I couldn't help it. I felt like it was following me. That evening, I decided to confront it. I waited until nightfall, when the house was quiet. The moonlight filtered in through the window, casting faint shadows on the floor. I stood in front of the bathroom mirror, staring at my reflection. The air felt thick with tension. The low hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen was the only sound, but even that seemed too loud, too alive. I waited for what felt like an eternity, my breath shallow, trying to steady myself. I moved my hand slowly, raising it to my face. The reflection mirrored me perfectly, just as it always had. No delays, no strange movements. Everything was normal. But then, I felt it. There was a weight, an invisible pressure in the air. The silence grew heavier, like the room itself was holding its breath. I watched closely as my reflection began to move differently. It wasn't much at first. A slight delay in my actions. A blink that didn't quite match mine. I exhaled shakily, trying to calm myself. But then, something changed. The reflection's eyes, my eyes, didn't look at me anymore. Instead, they seemed to shift, darting toward the corner of the mirror. It wasn't just looking at the room, it was studying it. Watching something that wasn't there. It was as if my reflection had its own thoughts, its own intentions. My pulse quickened. Okay, I whispered to myself, feeling both a surge of fear and determination. This ends now. I reached forward, my hand trembling as I touched the cold surface of the mirror. The reflection, too, moved its hand, perfectly synchronized with mine. But then, something happened. It didn't pull away. My fingers were pressed flat against the mirror, my reflection doing the same. And for a moment, everything was still. The room felt colder now, like the warmth had been sucked out. A quiet hum filled my ears, faint but growing louder. My heart pounded in my chest, and the silence stretched on, unbearable. Then, my reflection smiled. It wasn't a friendly smile. It was something darker, something predatory. The corners of its mouth curled up, slowly, as if it knew a secret I didn't. A cold chill shot down my spine. The feeling of being watched, of being trapped, intensified. I tried to pull my hand away, but my reflection's fingers didn't release. I couldn't move. Let go, I whispered hoarsely, trying to pull back. But the reflection, my reflection, didn't obey. It only tightened its grip. In a panic, I yanked my hand back hard, and finally, the reflection released me. I stumbled back, my breath coming in sharp gasps. The mirror, once again, looked just like it should, normal. My reflection was back to its usual motions, perfectly synchronized with mine. It was as if nothing had happened. But everything had changed. I couldn't stop shaking. It wasn't just a trick of the light. It wasn't a case of sleep deprivation or stress. No, this was real. And it was happening to me. The feeling lingered long after I left the bathroom, like an itch I couldn't scratch. The strange sense that the reflection wasn't just reflecting anymore. It was aware. And it was watching. I spent the night lying awake, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing. What was it? What did it want from me? Was it trying to take over? I couldn't escape the thought that it was just waiting for the right moment, waiting for me to slip up. To make one wrong move, one small mistake. But I knew one thing for sure, whatever it wasn't going to stop. The next few days dragged on in a blur, each moment stretching longer than the last. My reflection seemed to be biding its time, not doing anything overtly alarming, but I knew better. I could feel its presence, lurking just behind the glass, always watching, always waiting. I began to avoid mirrors altogether. At work, I kept my eyes averted from the reflective surfaces of windows, and when I passed by a bathroom mirror at home, I quickened my pace, as if the faster I moved, the safer I would be. But no matter how fast I ran, I couldn't outrun it. It was there in the corners of my vision, never quite making a move, but always present, like a shadow you can't quite escape. Every time I caught a glimpse of it in my peripheral vision, I had to stop myself from looking back. It was like a compulsion, as if the reflection wanted me to look, to engage. And then, it happened again. One evening, I was sitting at the kitchen table, trying to focus on a book, but my mind wouldn't settle. It kept drifting back to that smile, the predatory grin that had twisted across my reflection's face. My hands trembled as I turned the page, but I couldn't stop thinking about it. It was late. The house was quiet, save for the soft hum of the refrigerator and the faint rustling of the wind outside. I glanced up at the kitchen clock. It was almost midnight. The house felt heavier now, like the air was thick with an unspoken pressure. That sensation of being watched was unbearable. I tried to distract myself, but my gaze kept flicking to the hallway where the bathroom mirror was. I couldn't help it. Slowly, I stood up, my legs feeling stiff, my heart racing. I had to see. I had to know. The hallway stretched out before me, dark and silent. As I approached the bathroom door, a faint creak echoed from the floor beneath me, and I froze. It sounded like someone else was in the house. No, it was just the floorboards. I pushed open the bathroom door and stepped inside. The lights flickered once, casting long shadows across the walls. There it was, just like before, the mirror. I stood before it, taking slow, deliberate breaths. The reflection stared back at me, as expected. But something was wrong. The eyes were too still, too focused. My heart skipped a beat as I realized the reflection wasn't mirroring my actions. It was waiting. I stared at myself. I raised my hand to touch my face, as I had done countless times before, but this time it was different. My reflection didn't move. It remained unnervingly still. "Come on," I whispered, my voice shaking. "Move. Please, just move." For a long, agonizing moment, the reflection stayed frozen, not a flicker of movement. And then, without warning, it smiled again. That same dark, twisted smile that sent a chill straight through my chest. But this time, it was different. This time, the reflection wasn't just smiling. It was coming closer. I gasped as I watched my reflection's hand reach out of the mirror. Slowly, deliberately, it reached for me, its fingers stretching toward the surface of the glass. My breath caught in my throat. I stepped back instinctively, but the hand didn't stop. It pushed against the glass, as though testing the barrier between us. I stumbled back, panic surging through me. My legs felt weak, and I had to grip the sink to stay standing. The hand, my reflection's hand, continued its slow, deliberate push against the glass, as if it were looking for a way out. My mind raced. Could I stop it? Could I break the mirror? No, I couldn't. It was too dangerous. Too alive. In that moment, I understood. It wasn't just waiting. It was trying to reach through the glass. Trying to find a way into my world. I had to get away. I had to get out of there. I turned and bolted out of the bathroom, my heart pounding in my chest, my feet barely keeping up with my frantic pace. As I reached the hallway, I dared to glance over my shoulder. The reflection had followed. It wasn't just staring at me anymore. It was moving, shifting, almost as if it were stepping out of the frame, its form warping and stretching with every blink. I ran faster, my breath coming in ragged gasps, my mind too clouded with fear to think clearly. I burst into the living room, eyes darting around for a way out, for something, anything, to make this nightmare stop. I heard the soft scrape of feet against the floor behind me. It was following me. I didn't stop. I couldn't, but I could hear it. The sound of my reflection, no longer confined to the mirror, moving through the house, stalking me. I rushed toward the front door. I had to get out. I had to. A cold hand clamped down on my shoulder. I froze, my entire body going numb. I didn't have to turn around to know. I could feel it. The mirror wasn't behind me anymore. It was right there. I couldn't breathe. The hand on my shoulder was cold, unnaturally cold, like it had been plucked from the depths of ice. My muscles locked in place, the terror making it impossible to move. The world felt suffocating, as though the walls themselves were closing in around me. I didn't dare turn around. I couldn't. The weight of the hand alone was enough to paralyze me. It was as if the very air had turned thick, like the pressure of some invisible force was squeezing the life out of me. A shiver ran down my spine as the hand moved, its fingers curling with a slow, deliberate motion. I could feel it. The touch of something not quite human. Something that shouldn't exist. Suddenly, a voice. Low, distorted, like it was coming from the depths of the earth, or perhaps from behind 1,000 layers of glass. But it was unmistakable. You can't escape me, it whispered, each word sending a shock through my body. My heart was hammering in my chest, and I finally did the one thing my instincts screamed at me to do. I tore myself away from that chilling grip. I whipped around, my vision blurred by panic, expecting to see the worst. But nothing was there. The hallway behind me was empty. The cold air that had gripped me vanished, and for a fleeting moment, I thought maybe I had imagined it all. Maybe it was just a product of my mind, twisted by exhaustion and fear. But then I saw it. In the living room mirror, I saw myself. Not standing in front of the door, not trembling in terror, but standing perfectly still, staring back at me. It wasn't me. It couldn't be. My reflection was wrong. The face that stared back at me was expressionless, its eyes dead and lifeless. Its lips were thin, pulled back into that same twisted smile. But it wasn't just the smile, it was the way the eyes locked onto mine. There was malice there. Pure, unfiltered malice. I couldn't move. I couldn't tear my eyes away from it. It was as if my own reflection was holding me captive, dragging me into its gaze. Then, just as quickly, my reflection blinked. But it wasn't like my normal blink. It was slow, deliberate, calculated. And in that moment, my reflection seemed to notice me, as if it were aware of the distance between us. It moved. The reflection leaned forward, its face drawing closer to the glass, its eyes narrowing with a predatory hunger. I stumbled backward, my legs refusing to cooperate, my breath coming in sharp, panic bursts. But the reflection kept getting closer, its face pressing against the glass. And then it grinned. It wasn't the smile of a person. It was something darker. Something that shouldn't have existed. It wasn't a reflection anymore, it was a presence. A thing that wasn't just mimicking me, it was trying to become me. The longer I stared at it, the more I realized that I wasn't looking at a mirror anymore. I was looking at a doorway. A portal into something else. Something alive. The glass trembled, just slightly, and the air around me grew heavier once again. The reflection's hand pressed against the surface, its fingers slowly curling around the edge of the mirror as though it were trying to push through. The glass cracked. I blinked, and in that brief moment of disorientation, the reflection's face distorted. The features twisted and warped, becoming something more monstrous, its eyes growing wide and wild, its mouth stretching too far. I screamed. The glass shattered. In an instant, everything exploded into chaos. The reflection leapt from the mirror with a sound like 1,000 shattering pieces of glass. It surged toward me, its body bending and twisting in ways that shouldn't have been possible. The figure was no longer my reflection, it was something else entirely. Something wrong. It was like watching a nightmare unfold before my eyes. I backed up into the wall, my breath ragged, my mind fighting to make sense of what was happening. It wasn't just a reflection anymore, it was a thing trying to become me, trying to replace me. I had to get out. I spun around, my legs moving before my mind could catch up. I ran down the hall, toward the front door, toward the one thing that could give me freedom, the world outside. But as I reached for the doorknob, a cold presence washed over me. The door wouldn't open. I pulled and twisted the handle, but it was as though the door was locked from the other side. Panic surged within me, every instinct telling me to keep moving, to find an escape. And then I heard it. A soft, mocking chuckle, barely a whisper, coming from behind me. I turned slowly, my heart sinking. There, standing in the hallway, was the reflection. No, it wasn't my reflection anymore. It was me. Or something that looked like me. The figure in the hallway was wearing my clothes, my face, but the eyes were dark and empty, devoid of anything human. It moved slowly, almost lazily, as if toying with me, savoring the moment before it finished what it had started. It wasn't trying to kill me. It was trying to replace me. I was too scared to move. Too terrified to scream. The figure's grin widened, its steps echoing through the silence like a death march. I didn't know what it wanted. All I knew was that it was coming closer. And in that moment, I realized, with a cold certainty, that the mirror was no longer just a reflection. It was the doorway to something far worse. The figure took another step forward. I froze, rooted to the spot. It wasn't just its appearance that horrified me, it was the fact that it knew exactly what I was thinking. The air around me thickened as the creature, the reflection, began to smile wider. A slow, menacing grin that spread across its face like it was savoring the terror in my eyes. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. My throat felt tight, as if the very air was being sucked from my lungs. The door in front of me remained stubbornly locked, and the figure, no, the thing that looked like me, moved closer. I could feel the floor beneath me vibrate with every step it took. I stumbled back, my hands hitting the door behind me in a desperate attempt to find some leverage. My heart was pounding, my mind was a blur of fear and confusion. I couldn't think. I couldn't escape. It wasn't supposed to be this way. It wasn't supposed to be alive. The creature cocked its head, as if studying me. It knew. It knew what I was thinking, what I was feeling. It was like it had been in my head all along, pulling my thoughts, twisting them into something dark, something wrong. It spoke, but its voice wasn't mine. It was lower, more guttural, as if coming from the depths of a cave. You thought you could outrun me, it whispered, its words slicing through the silence. But you can't. I am you. I have always been you. It stepped closer. Its movements were too fluid, too unnatural. I watched, horrified, as the creature's eyes flickered to mine and then down to the floor. Its hand, no, my hand, reached out, as if it were offering me a choice. A choice? What could I do? It wasn't offering me freedom. It wasn't offering me help. It was offering me nothing. I backed away as it reached for me, my own hand trembling uncontrollably. The reflection's eyes followed my every movement, mirroring me in every way, except for the malice in its gaze. That cold, dead gaze that seemed to pierce straight into my soul. I had nowhere to go. The hallway was closing in on me, the walls seemingly shrinking with every passing second. The house, the space that had once been a sanctuary, was now a cage. And I was the prisoner. I was trapped. Don't you see? The reflection mocked. I was never a part of you. I was waiting waiting for you to realize I've always been in here. In your mind. In your soul. I just needed you to let me in. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run. I wanted to do something, but I couldn't move. I couldn't fight. The creature, the reflection, was no longer something I could reason with. It was a part of me, and yet it wasn't. It was other, a darkness that had been festering just beneath the surface of my thoughts, my fears, my doubts. I tried to speak. My mouth felt dry. My voice was hoarse, barely a whisper. What do you want? I choked out, my voice barely audible. The reflection paused, its twisted smile curling even further. I want you to see. The words were soft, too soft. I want you to understand that this world is not yours anymore. It's mine. You spent your life looking into mirrors, thinking you saw yourself. But all you saw was me. And now, it stepped closer again, its hand reaching out to touch my shoulder, cold and clammy. Now, it's time for you to see your true self. The one I've been waiting to bring out. The moment its fingers brushed my skin, a searing pain shot through me. It wasn't physical, it was deeper than that, like something was ripping at the very fabric of who I was. My vision blurred. The walls began to shift around me, warping, bending into impossible shapes. I gasped, my chest tightening as the pain intensified. And then, for a brief moment, everything stopped. The reflection wasn't there anymore. I was alone in the hallway. The door in front of me was still locked, but I wasn't sure I wanted to escape anymore. I wasn't sure what I was anymore. I reached up to touch my face, my fingertips trembling. And that's when I felt it, something wrong. Something not quite right. My skin was cold, slick, unnatural. I looked at my hands. They were different. It was like I was staring at someone else's hands, longer, paler, unnaturally smooth. I turned my palms toward me, the skin stretched tight, as though it were no longer my own. I staggered back, looking desperately around the hallway. The mirrors. Every mirror. I had to see. I had to see if it was real. I turned toward the living room, where the mirror still hung on the wall. I walked slowly, my legs heavy, my body trembling. With every step, I could feel something shifting inside me, something dark pushing against the walls of my mind. I reached the mirror and stared into it. At first, I didn't recognize the face that stared back at me. It was me. But not really. It was a reflection, yes. But it was also alive. The grin was gone. The eyes, those cold, lifeless eyes, were filled with something else now. I was the reflection. And the reflection was me. And as I stood there, staring at the glass, the last thought I had was simple, yet terrifying. I had become the thing I feared most. And now, it was my turn to take over. The reflection smiled again. And this time, it was my smile. Have you ever had the eerie feeling that the world around you is not quite as it seems? That maybe you've crossed some invisible line between what is real and what is not. I never believed in those kinds of things until it happened to me. It started on an ordinary evening. I was returning from work, the kind of tiredness that drapes over you like a heavy blanket. The evening air had a crispness to it, and the sky was streaked with soft hues of orange and pink, signaling the end of the day. As I approached my neighborhood, a strange chill crept up my spine, though the temperature hadn't dropped. I shrugged it off as just the exhaustion catching up to me. I turned the corner, and the familiar side of my house should have been there, standing proudly as it always had. But there was nothing. Nothing but an empty field. My heart skipped a beat. I stopped dead in my tracks. My house, my home, was gone. In its place, an overgrown patch of land stretched out before me, with weeds swaying slightly in the breeze. I blinked, rubbed my eyes, and took a step forward. The emptiness remained. I spun around, hoping it was some cruel joke or maybe even a mirage, but the street was the same. Everything was as it should be, except for that one glaring absence. I called out, "Hello?" My voice echoed against the stillness, but there was no answer. I pulled out my phone and dialed the number for my roommate, Thomas. The phone rang once, twice, before going to voicemail. I hung up and called again. No answer. The silence on the other end made my stomach turn. With shaky hands, I approached the nearest neighbor's house. An old couple lived there, the kind that always greeted me with a warm smile and an offer for tea. I knocked on the door, and after a few moments, the woman opened it. Her face lit up in a kind, welcoming smile, but it faded as she saw the confusion in my eyes. "Can I help you, dear?" she asked, her voice tinged with a gentle concern. I live just down the street," I said, trying to calm my racing heart. "My house, it's gone." "Where did it go?" Her face remained neutral. She glanced down the street, then back at me. "Dawn?" she asked, her tone almost incredulous. "There's never been a house there." "You must be mistaken." My mouth went dry. "What do you mean?" "I've lived there for 5 years." She shook her head slowly. "I'm sorry, but no house has ever stood there. Maybe you've confused the address? You look a little tired." I stared at her in disbelief. My house was there. I knew it was. My memories were flooded with images of the front door, the living room couch, the kitchen where I had made dinner last week. But the more I tried to recall, the more the details seemed to blur, like smudges on a glass I couldn't wipe clean. "Please," I said, my voice trembling. "Are you sure you don't remember it? There has to be some mistake." She looked at me kindly, but her eyes had a strange, distant quality. "I'm afraid you've made a mistake, dear. There's nothing there but land." I left her doorstep in a daze, feeling as if the ground beneath me had shifted. The world around me had become wrong, and I was starting to doubt my own memories. What was happening? Could it be that I had lost my mind? But no! It wasn't just a bad dream. It was real. My house had been there. I had lived there. I wandered the neighborhood, hoping to find someone else who could offer an explanation. But every person I spoke to, every passerby I stopped, all told me the same thing. "You must be confused. There's no house there." By the time night fell, I had spoken to dozens of people, none of whom remembered my house. It was as if it had never existed at all. The sky had darkened, and the streets, once familiar, now felt suffocating, as if they were closing in on me. The empty lot where my house should have been loomed in front of me, an oppressive void in the night. I walked to the edge of the lot and stood there, staring out at the desolation, unable to process what had just happened. Had I gone mad? Was this some twisted prank? But the looks in people's eyes, those pitiful, concerned glances, told me it wasn't a joke. They believed it. They genuinely believed there had never been a house there. I paced in circles, trying to make sense of everything. My breath came in shallow gasps. I didn't know where to go or what to do. I needed to figure this out. I needed to find my home. But the more I searched, the more uncertain I became. Was I truly losing my mind? Or was something else happening here, something I couldn't understand? Every person I asked gave me the same unhelpful answer, and every time they spoke, I felt myself sinking further into a hole I couldn't escape. And as I stood there, on that empty stretch of land, one thought consumed me. If my house never existed, then where had I been living all this time? I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. The questions twisted in my mind like a knot that refused to untangle. I lay in a small motel room, the hum of the air conditioner the only sound in the otherwise silent space. Every creak of the floorboards made me jump, and the pale light from the streetlights outside cast long shadows across the walls. I thought back to my house, the place I had spent so many nights in, the place that had felt like home. But now, every time I tried to picture it, the details slipped away. The furniture, the pictures on the walls, the smell of coffee in the morning, it was all fading, like a dream I was desperately trying to remember. I tried calling Thomas again. His phone went straight to voicemail again. No messages. No missed calls. I wanted to drive over to his place, but deep down, I knew it would be pointless. If he wasn't answering, maybe he didn't remember either. My mind raced. I had to go back. There had to be an explanation somewhere. I couldn't just let it go. Maybe I was missing something, some clue that would make it all make sense. At dawn, I drove back to the area where my house should have been. The neighborhood looked the same, but something felt off. The houses, the streets, even the trees, they were all too quiet, too still. It was as if time had stopped, or worse, as if I had wandered into a place where time didn't exist at all. I parked at the end of the street and walked towards the lot. My heart thudded in my chest, each step feeling heavier than the last. The air smelled damp, as if it had rained recently, but the ground was dry. I stepped closer to the empty space, trying to make sense of it. The weeds, the scattered rocks, there was no sign of any structure ever having been there. I squatted down and ran my hand over the ground, as if expecting to find some trace of my past life, a forgotten fragment that would put everything back together. But all I found was dirt and more dirt. Then, just as I was about to stand up, I heard it. A sound, faint at first, then growing louder. A voice. It wasn't coming from the lot, but from somewhere behind me. Soft at first, then clearer, like someone whispering my name. James. I froze. My body went rigid with fear. I turned quickly, scanning the street for any sign of movement. But there was nothing. Just the emptiness of the quiet morning. No one was there. The whispering stopped. For a moment, I thought I had imagined it. But then I heard it again, this time, closer. James. I spun around, my eyes searching wildly, but there was no one in sight. I was alone. Or at least, that's what I tried to convince myself of. It wasn't until I turned back towards the lot that I noticed it. Something had changed. The dirt, the rocks, even the air, it felt different. As if a shift had occurred, and the ground beneath me wasn't quite as solid as it should have been. I took a step back, my pulse quickening. I hadn't imagined that. Something was wrong. Something was watching me. I turned on my heel and ran. I didn't know where I was going, but I had to get away. I didn't stop until I reached my car, my hands shaking as I fumbled to unlock the door. I slammed it shut and locked it. For a few moments, I just sat there, trying to catch my breath. What the hell had just happened? What had I heard? And why did it feel as though everything around me was shifting? As if reality itself was fraying at the edges, like a threadbare piece of cloth about to unravel. I looked at the rearview mirror. The reflection of my own face stared back at me, but something was different. The person in the mirror didn't look quite like me. It was me, yes, but the eyes, they were colder, more distant. It was as if the reflection wasn't mine at all, but someone else's, someone who had always been there. I blinked, and the image in the mirror returned to normal. But the unease remained. Was I losing my grip on reality? Or was there something more going on? Something I couldn't see? Something that was waiting to reveal itself, piece by piece? I drove aimlessly for hours, my mind racing. Where could I go? Who could I turn to for answers? Every person I spoke to seemed to deny the existence of my house, and now I was beginning to question whether it had ever been real. As I pulled into a small, nearly empty diner, I could feel the weight of my confusion pressing down on me. I needed answers, but I wasn't sure where to find them. My thoughts were spiraling, the ground beneath me unstable. I needed someone to tell me what was happening. I sat down at a booth and ordered coffee. The waitress, an older woman with tired eyes, smiled as she placed the cup in front of me. Anything else, honey? I shook my head, my mind elsewhere. She walked away, but as I watched her leave, something caught my eye. A figure in the corner of the diner, sitting by the window, staring straight at me. It was a man, older, dressed in a faded jacket. He was watching me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. And then, he smiled. A smile that didn't reach his eyes. A smile that didn't feel right. I felt my heart thudding in my chest. I couldn't look away. There was something deeply wrong about this man, something that made the air in the diner grow thick and suffocating. And as I watched him, he slowly, deliberately raised his hand and pointed directly at me. That was when I heard it again. James. I didn't wait. I grabbed my things and ran out of the diner, my breath coming in ragged gasps. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror again. The man was still there, standing by the window, watching me as I disappeared into the night. My heart pounded. What was happening to me? Had I truly gone mad, or was something else trying to make itself known? Something I wasn't meant to understand. But one thing was certain, I wasn't going to stop searching for answers. Even if it meant unraveling everything I thought I knew about myself, about my life, and about the very fabric of reality itself. The night stretched on, but sleep was a distant memory. I drove for what felt like hours, the headlights of my car slicing through the darkness, casting long shadows across the road. The streets were eerily empty, the silence broken only by the hum of the engine. I didn't know where I was going. All I knew was that I couldn't stay in the city, not with the echoes of that whisper still ringing in my ears. Not with the reflection in the rearview mirror haunting me. I needed to find someone who could explain all of this, someone who could give me a logical reason for the house that never existed, for the strange figure in the diner, for the creeping sense of unreality that was beginning to take over my life. But the further I drove, the more isolated I became. The roads blurred into one long, continuous stretch of asphalt, and the towns I passed seemed familiar yet foreign, as if I had driven through them countless times but couldn't place any of the details. I ended up in a small town, one I didn't recognize. The sign by the side of the road read Wilmington, a place I had never heard of. The quiet streets were lined with older houses, their windows dark, their porches sagging with the weight of time. I pulled into the parking lot of a rundown motel and stepped out of the car, the cold night air biting at my skin. My mind was spinning, but I needed to talk to someone. Inside, the motel lobby was dimly lit, the floor covered in threadbare carpet. The clerk behind the desk was an older man with gray hair and a face that seemed to have forgotten how to smile. He barely looked up as I approached. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice gruff. "I need a room," I said, my voice sounding strange even to my own ears. The panic that had been simmering under the surface of my thoughts was beginning to rise again. I had no idea why I had come here, why I had ended up in this forgotten town, but I knew I couldn't leave. Not yet. He gave me a key without a word, and I took it, barely registering the fact that the number on the key was 13. I hadn't noticed until I was already heading toward the hallway. The room was small, dimly lit, and smelled faintly of mildew. The walls were thin, and I could hear the distant sound of footsteps in the hallway. The bed was unmade, the sheets rumpled and old. It was everything I should have expected from a place like this, a temporary stop for weary travelers, but it felt wrong, like nothing about this place had ever been touched by time. I set my bag down on the bed and sat by the window, staring out into the night. The town seemed so quiet, too quiet. Then, just as I was beginning to relax, I heard it again. That whisper. "James." It came from outside, faint at first, then louder, as if it was being carried on the wind. My heart stopped. I looked around the room, the shadows stretching long and jagged across the walls. I had to get out of here. I stood up and went to the door, my hand shaking as I reached for the knob. Just as I was about to turn it, I froze. There, outside the door, a figure stood. A man. A shadow in the hallway, his face obscured by darkness, but I could feel his eyes on me. His presence was so overwhelming that it was as if the air itself had become heavier, pressing in on me from all sides. "James," the voice whispered again, this time so close it seemed to come from inside my own mind. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. The figure in the doorway didn't move, didn't speak, but I could feel his gaze burning into me, a cold, unrelenting stare that made my skin crawl. Then, without warning, the door slammed open, the figure gone in an instant. I stumbled backward, my heart racing. What the hell was happening? I was losing my mind. I had to be. But as I looked around the room again, I noticed something else. Something that made my stomach churn. The bed was no longer where it had been. The sheets, the pillow, they were gone, replaced with an empty space, as if they had never existed. I rushed over to the spot where the bed had been, feeling the floor beneath my fingers. It was cold, the wood splintered and rough, but nothing about it made sense. The room was still the same in every way, yet it wasn't. I backed away from the empty space, my breath coming in short gasps. This wasn't real. It couldn't be. Just then, the lights flickered. Once. Twice. And then, the room went black. I screamed, but the sound didn't leave my mouth. The darkness was suffocating, closing in on me from every direction. My mind spun, every thought a chaotic blur. I tried to focus, to make sense of it, but the silence was deafening. I couldn't see, I couldn't hear, I couldn't feel anything except the crushing weight of terror. And then, the whisper came again. "James." It was right behind me. I spun around, my eyes straining to make out any shape, any shadow. But the darkness swallowed everything whole. I reached out, my fingers grazing the air, searching for something, anything to hold on to. The whisper was so close now, I could feel its breath on my skin. James. Suddenly, the lights flared back on, and I found myself standing in the center of the room, gasping for air. The bed was back. The sheets were perfectly made, as if nothing had changed. But the terror still clung to me, the weight of it pressing down on my chest. I wasn't sure if I had imagined it all. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. Something was changing. And it was only a matter of time before it all came crashing down. I spent the rest of that night pacing the room, unable to shake the feeling that the walls were closing in on me. My mind raced with the remnants of what I had experienced, the whisper, the darkness, the absence of the bed. I tried to rationalize it, telling myself that it was some kind of nightmare, that maybe the stress of everything had finally taken its toll. But deep down, I knew it wasn't just in my head. It couldn't be. I grabbed my phone and checked the time. It was 3:47 a.m., the numbers blinking in the dim light. The silence in the motel room was so thick it felt like it was pressing against me. I needed to get out of here. I couldn't stay in this place any longer. But where could I go? What was I even looking for? I stood in front of the window, looking out at the darkened town. The streets were deserted, the buildings casting long shadows across the pavement. For a moment, I considered leaving the motel, driving away into the night. But something held me there, something I couldn't explain. It was like I was tethered to this place, to the unanswered questions that were gnawing at the edges of my mind. Suddenly, I heard a sound. A soft, almost imperceptible tap, tap, tap against the window. I froze, my heart racing. Slowly, I turned my head, my eyes scanning the darkness outside. There, just beyond the glass, was a figure. A silhouette against the dim light of the street lamp. It was a woman. She stood motionless, staring at me with wide, unblinking eyes. Her face was obscured by shadow, but I could feel her gaze on me, piercing through the glass. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. I was paralyzed, locked in place by the intensity of her stare. And then, she raised her hand and pointed directly at me. I jerked back, stumbling away from the window, my heart hammering in my chest. What the hell was going on? Who was she? And why was she looking at me like that? I dared to glance back at the window, but the woman was gone. The street outside was empty again. The figure, the tapping, it was all gone, as if it had never existed. But I couldn't shake the feeling that she had been real, that she was still out there, watching me, waiting for something. The unease that had settled in my stomach grew heavier, like a weight I couldn't escape. I needed to leave. I couldn't stay in this town any longer. But just as I turned to grab my bag, my phone buzzed. A text message. I picked it up, my hands trembling as I read the words. "You're not supposed to remember. Let it go." My breath caught in my throat. The words felt like a punch to the gut. Who was sending me this? Why? I looked at the phone, the screen illuminating my face in the dim room. There was no name attached to the message, no number. Just the message. The message that made no sense. But it was a warning. I could feel it in my bones. I tried to call Thomas again, but the phone went straight to voicemail. This time, I left a message. My voice sounded distant, almost disconnected, as I spoke into the receiver. I don't know what's happening. I need you to help me. I think I'm losing my mind. Please, just pick up. Call me back." I didn't expect him to call. He hadn't answered any of my calls so far. But I had to try. I had to reach out to someone, anyone. I grabbed my bag, my mind reeling, and left the motel room. The hallway was silent, the air thick with an almost oppressive stillness. It felt wrong. I couldn't explain it, but the building itself felt like it was holding its breath. When I stepped outside, the air was colder than before. The sky above was a deep, endless black, and the streets were empty, like the town itself had been abandoned. I looked around, trying to make sense of the surroundings, but the familiar discomfort returned, creeping up my spine. I walked to my car, but before I could open the door, I heard it. A sound. A voice. "James." I spun around, my breath catching in my throat. There, standing at the end of the street, was the woman. The same woman from the window. She was just standing there, staring at me with those same wide eyes. And this time, I didn't hesitate. I ran. I didn't care where I was going, I just needed to get away. I sprinted down the empty street, the sound of my footsteps echoing in the stillness. But no matter how fast I ran, I couldn't escape the feeling that something was following me. I could feel it, something closing in, drawing closer with each step. As I turned a corner, I skidded to a stop, my eyes wide with shock. There, at the end of the alley, stood a man. The same man I had seen in the diner. The one who had pointed at me. His cold smile was back, twisted and empty. I was trapped. Before I could even think of running in the opposite direction, the world seemed to tilt. The ground shifted beneath my feet, and the air grew thick, oppressive. My vision blurred, and I staggered, my legs giving out from under me. Everything around me was shifting, warping, like I was slipping through the cracks of reality itself. The alley, the street, the man, all of it felt like it was being pulled apart, piece by piece. And then, darkness. I woke up in my car. I wasn't sure how I got there. My heart was pounding, and my breath was shallow. The world outside was eerily still, and I could hear the faint hum of the engine. I sat up, disoriented, and looked around. The town was gone. The alley, the street, even the diner, it was all gone. In its place was the familiar stretch of road I had been driving on before, the one that led to nowhere. Was I still dreaming? Had I lost my mind completely? I didn't have time to think about it. I started the car and drove away, the endless road stretching out before me, and the unsettling feeling of being watched never leaving me. I had to find the answers. But the deeper I dug, the more I realized something terrifying. The answers might not be out there. They might be inside me. And that was a truth I wasn't sure I was ready to face. The next morning felt wrong. The sun was too bright, and the world around me seemed too quiet, as though it were holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I drove aimlessly for hours, not really sure where I was headed, just needing to put as much distance between myself and that town, the motel, and the strange woman who had been haunting my every thought since I saw her. My phone still hadn't rung, and I hadn't heard from Thomas. The message, that cryptic warning, "You're not supposed to remember. Let it go," kept playing over and over in my head like a broken record. I pulled over to the side of the road and took a deep breath. The sky was clear, the air felt fresh, but it didn't matter. Nothing felt real anymore. I needed answers. But the more I searched for them, the more they slipped away. There was a small town ahead, a sign that read Woodbrook, but it didn't feel familiar. It felt wrong. It didn't look like any place I had passed through. The houses were too quiet, the streets too empty. It was almost as though no one had ever lived there. The air, too, felt still, unnaturally so. I couldn't explain it, but I knew something was off. My skin prickled with anxiety, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. I pulled into a small gas station, hoping to find some sort of clue or, at the very least, a distraction. I walked inside, and the bell above the door jingled softly. The attendant, a man in his late 50s, barely looked up from the counter. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice flat and lifeless. "I just need some directions," I said, trying to shake the sense of dread creeping up my spine. "Where are you headed?" His eyes were glassy, almost vacant, as though he wasn't really seeing me. I hesitated, unsure of how to phrase it. "I'm not sure. Just driving." He nodded slowly, as if that made sense. "You might want to keep driving. This place, people don't come here unless they're lost." I froze. The words echoed in my head. Unless they're lost. I forced a smile. "I'm just passing through. I don't think I'm lost." "You will be," he muttered, almost under his breath. Then he suddenly straightened up, his gaze sharpening. "You should leave. It's not safe for people like you here." I felt a chill run down my spine. The unease that had been building in me for days was now reaching a breaking point. Before I could respond, the door jingled behind me, and a woman stepped inside. She was tall, dressed in a faded red coat, her hair pulled back into a tight bun. She glanced at me quickly, then turned to the attendant. "Morning," she said, her voice smooth, but there was something unsettling about her smile. The attendant didn't respond. He just continued to stare at me with those vacant eyes. I felt a surge of panic rise in my chest. I needed to get out. I turned to leave, but before I could reach the door, the woman spoke again. "You shouldn't be here," she said softly, as if she already knew what I was thinking. "You're looking for something, but you're not going to find it here." I stopped in my tracks. My heart hammered in my chest, and I turned to face her. "What do you mean?" The woman's smile faded slightly, replaced with a look of something. Worry, perhaps? Or was it pity? I couldn't tell. "You don't remember, do you? You've forgotten everything." "Forgotten what?" I demanded, my voice rising. The woman stepped closer. "The truth. It's all gone. They erased it." Who erased it?" She shook her head slowly, as if weighing whether she should say more. Her eyes flicked toward the attendant, then back to me. "They," she repeated, her voice softer now, "are watching. And if you don't stop looking, if you keep pushing, you'll be just like the rest of them." I didn't understand. I couldn't understand. "Who are you talking about? What are you saying?" But before she could answer, she turned and walked out of the station, disappearing into the same silence that had been suffocating the town. I stood there, my mind racing. I wanted to run after her, demand answers, but something deep within me told me I shouldn't. I couldn't. I looked back at the attendant. His eyes were still locked on me, his lips stretched into a thin line. I didn't know what to do. Everything was slipping away. The town, the people, my memories. I could feel it. The truth I was chasing was just out of reach. And yet, every time I tried to grasp it, it vanished into thin air. I left the gas station and got back into my car. The woman's words echoed in my mind, and I couldn't shake the feeling that they were somehow connected to everything that had been happening to me. You don't remember. They erased it. I gripped the steering wheel, the urgency building within me. Where was Thomas? Why hadn't he called? And why did it feel like I was being erased along with everything else? I drove away from Woodbrook, the town growing smaller and smaller in my rearview mirror, and yet the sense of being followed only intensified. It wasn't just the town I had to escape. It was everything. And they weren't going to let me. I didn't send this message. It was the first thing I thought when I saw the text on my phone. It wasn't just the content that made my heart race. It was the fact that I hadn't written it. And yet, there it was, in my sent messages folder. The text was simple. I'm sorry for everything. I didn't mean to hurt you. I stared at it for what felt like forever. The name in the recipients list was someone I hadn't spoken to in years, Lily. We hadn't been close since high school, and I didn't even know how to contact her anymore. She had moved away, or at least, I thought she had. But this text, from my number? No way. I immediately opened the conversation, but there was no trace of it. Just a blank chat screen. Nothing. My stomach twisted. Had I somehow sent it in my sleep? Or was I going crazy? I checked the time the message had been sent 2 hours ago. The strange thing was, I hadn't been near my phone for the past 3 hours. I had left it charging in the living room while I was in the kitchen. That's when I realized it wasn't just one message. I found another one. This time, it was to a different person. Max, my childhood friend. The message was even stranger. I didn't forget Max. I just couldn't keep going. What did that even mean? I hadn't spoken to Max in almost 5 years, not since that night when everything fell apart. What was I even talking about? It wasn't like me to text these people, let alone send cryptic messages. My hand shook as I checked the rest of the messages in my sent folder. They were all the same, texts I didn't remember writing. Conversations with people I hadn't spoken to in ages. They all began with apologies, confessions, or cryptic phrases that made no sense to me. What was happening? I went through the entire list of contacts. Some were old friends, others were just random acquaintances. Each one had a different message, but they all had one thing in common: they were sent from my phone. The only problem was, I never sent them. The panic began to rise in my chest. I needed answers. But as I started typing a message to Lily, my fingers froze. I couldn't remember the last time I'd spoken to her or why I'd even apologized. It was like a part of me had forgotten those years. A big, gaping hole in my memory. And yet, these messages, these ghosts of conversations, kept showing up, scattered throughout my phone like fragments of something I should have known, but didn't. I glanced nervously around the room. The silence felt too oppressive, too heavy. Was someone messing with me? I didn't know who would have access to my phone or why they would send such things, but I felt like I was being watched. I turned to my desk. It was just an ordinary day. Nothing out of place. Nothing strange. Yet, it all felt wrong. It started with a message, but it felt like it was leading to something bigger, something I wasn't ready for. And that's when I heard the noise. A faint tapping. At first, I thought it was the sound of the radiator clicking, but it was rhythmic, deliberate. Someone was tapping on the window. I didn't even need to look to know that I was alone in the apartment. I stood still, my heart pounding in my ears. The sound was coming closer, one tap after another, more insistent now. I forced myself to move. Slowly, I walked toward the window, my footsteps louder than they should have been. I reached for the blinds, hesitated for a second, then pulled them open. Nothing. There was no one there. The street was empty. The sky, gray. No sign of movement. But the tapping had stopped. And that's when the phone buzzed again. This time, it was a message from Max. He hadn't replied to my earlier text, but now there was something new. The message was simple. You don't remember, do you? I felt my blood run cold. Who could have sent that? And why was I suddenly drowning in this sense of wrongness? I glanced back at the window again, just in case, but there was nothing. Just the empty street. Still, I didn't know what was happening. My phone, my messages, my life, it all felt like a puzzle missing pieces. The more I tried to understand it, the more I realized that the answers were slipping further away. And that's when I noticed something else. There were no new messages in my inbox. There were only the ones I hadn't sent. Messages I couldn't remember writing. And then, I remembered something else. The last message from Max, the one that had haunted me. You don't remember, do you? I hadn't written that one either. And it terrified me to think, if someone else was using my phone, was someone else using me too? What if they were the ones controlling my actions? My thoughts? I could feel the walls closing in. The tapping began again, louder this time. And I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't just on the window anymore. It was inside. Inside my head. The tapping didn't stop. It was relentless now, pounding against my skull as much as it was the window. I couldn't tell if it was the window anymore, or if it had somehow moved inside my head. It echoed in my ears like the rhythmic pulse of a ticking clock, only I didn't know what time it was anymore. I stumbled backward, my breath shallow and erratic. My hands shook as I reached for my phone again, desperately searching for some sign of normalcy, something that could tell me what the hell was going on. The messages had started as an anomaly, a glitch, a freak accident. But the more I thought about them, the more I realized they weren't just isolated events. They were connected in ways that I couldn't fully understand. Every one of them had been sent with an intention, a purpose behind it. But what was the purpose? I sat down on the couch, my heart racing. The tapping sound continued, still faint, but getting closer. I closed my eyes, trying to clear my thoughts, but that only made it worse. I could almost hear the words that hadn't been spoken yet, floating in the air, waiting for me to understand them. And then the phone buzzed again. The message was short, but it hit me like a punch to the gut. I see you. I stared at the screen, feeling my breath catch in my throat. Who was sending these? It wasn't Max. It wasn't Lily. These messages were coming from somewhere else, someone else. The text seemed to cut through the noise in my head like a warning. A realization I didn't want to face. I quickly checked the sender. It was from an unknown number, one I didn't recognize. I see you. I stood up abruptly, my mind spinning. This wasn't real, was it? Was I going mad? Maybe I was just imagining things. Or maybe someone was playing a sick joke on me. But no, I had been alone all day. There was no one else around to send these messages. And why didn't I remember writing them? The tapping stopped for a moment. A fleeting silence that felt even more unnatural. It was as if the world itself had taken a breath, waiting for something. I opened the messages again, scrolling through them. I couldn't stop myself. The more I read, the more it felt like the words were being written for me, not by me. It was like they had been waiting for me to find them, like they knew exactly when I would come looking. Another message appeared, this time from Max. You shouldn't have gone there. It's already too late. What did that mean? I hadn't even replied to him yet. I had no idea what he was talking about. My stomach twisted. I needed to get out of the apartment. I couldn't breathe. I had to do something, anything, before it all became too much. But the air around me was growing thick, oppressive. Every shadow seemed to stretch, distort, as if the walls themselves were breathing in time with my panic. The room felt smaller, like it was closing in, and my pulse quickened as the tapping began again, louder this time, impossible to ignore. I grabbed my jacket, my hands trembling. The phone buzzed again before I could leave. I cursed under my breath, but instinctively reached for it. This time, the message wasn't from anyone I knew. It was an unfamiliar number, one I didn't recognize. We're always watching. I felt my blood run cold. My vision blurred as I tried to make sense of it, tried to fight the rising panic. Who was watching me? Who could possibly be behind this? The tapping on the window grew louder, and I felt my legs give out. I collapsed onto the floor. It was too much. My mind was unraveling, piece by piece, like a thread slowly being pulled out from the inside. Suddenly, the air in the room shifted, as if it had thickened, turned heavier. The walls seemed to pulse with an energy that wasn't there before. And then, for a brief moment, I saw something. A figure. A shape standing just outside my window. I blinked rapidly, my breath catching in my throat. But when I looked again, it was gone. Had I imagined it? My heart pounded. I scrambled to my feet and ran to the window, pulling the blinds open with a violent force. The street outside was empty. There was no one there. Not a soul. But I couldn't shake the feeling. The feeling that something, someone, was watching me. And I wasn't the one in control. I took a shaky breath, trying to steady myself. My fingers hovered over the phone screen, but I couldn't bring myself to check the messages again. Not yet. My mind was a jumble of half-formed thoughts. I needed answers. But the question was, what if the answers I found only made things worse? I had to leave. I had to get out of the apartment, out of the suffocating darkness that seemed to be creeping in from the edges of my mind. But the tapping started again. This time, it wasn't at the window. It was coming from the door. Slow. Methodical. A knock. I froze, my heart thundering in my chest. There was no one there. No one I could see. But something was behind the door. I could feel it. Something was waiting for me. And I didn't know if I could escape it. Not anymore. The knock echoed through the apartment like a command. 1, 2, 3. Slow, deliberate, like someone had all the time in the world to wait for me to respond. But I couldn't. I couldn't move. The air was thick with tension, my muscles locked in place as I stood, staring at the door. What do I do? My heart pounded in my chest, each beat louder than the last. My palms were clammy, slick with cold sweat. I could feel the weight of something pressing down on me, a force I couldn't see but could almost taste in the air. The knocking didn't stop. It was maddening, impossible. There was no one there. I knew it. No one had come to my door. I could feel my legs trembling beneath me, but somehow I found the strength to take a step forward. Just one. My breath caught in my throat as I approached the door, my hand outstretched, barely touching the doorknob. And then, without warning, the knocking stopped. It wasn't that it faded away. It was as if the sound had been erased entirely, leaving only a silence that swallowed everything. The quiet was suffocating, unnatural. My own breathing sounded too loud in the stillness. I held my breath. I waited. But nothing came. No sound. No movement. I quickly stepped back, feeling a sudden surge of fear, a primal urge to escape. The room felt too small now, too close. I wasn't alone. I never had been. And the worst part was, I didn't know who or what was sharing this space with me. The messages, the knocking, the strange feeling of being watched, they weren't random. They were connected. I rushed to the window again, but there was nothing. Just the gray sky, the empty street. The tapping from the door still lingered in my mind, though. It was there, but it wasn't. I needed to get out. I grabbed my coat, my hands shaking as I threw it over my shoulders. The fear was overwhelming, clouding my thoughts, drowning me in confusion. But just as I was about to leave, my phone buzzed again. Open the door. I froze. I didn't need to look at the number this time. I already knew. The same unknown contact. The same haunting, cryptic messages. I felt my breath catch in my throat. The door, the knocking, it was all connected. The message, the thing outside my door, had been waiting for me to act, to do something. But what? And why? I could feel the tension building again, the oppressive weight of it pressing against me. I couldn't stay here anymore. I had to leave. I had to break free from whatever this was. But the question still burned in my mind. What if I opened the door? I knew, deep down, that something was waiting for me beyond it. But was it worse to stay here, trapped in this apartment, drowning in these messages, these whispers, these sounds that didn't belong? My pulse quickened, my thoughts racing as I moved toward the door. My hand hovered over the knob. For a moment, everything went still again. The air around me seemed to freeze, as if the world was holding its breath. I could almost hear the door calling me, beckoning me toward it, like a promise or a threat. I turned the knob. The door swung open, but there was no one there. I stood on the threshold, my heart racing, looking out into the empty hallway. It was quiet, still. The building was silent, the dim light from the overhead lamps casting long shadows along the walls. For a brief, desperate moment, I thought maybe it was over. Maybe this had all been a figment of my imagination. A trick of my mind, fueled by fear and the strange messages. But then I saw it. A figure. It was standing at the far end of the hall, half hidden in the shadows. I couldn't see it clearly, but I could feel it, something cold, something wrong. The figure was tall, too tall. The way it stood was unnerving, like it didn't quite belong to the space around it. I couldn't move. My feet felt like they were glued to the floor, my body frozen in place. And then, the figure shifted. It stepped forward, but its movement was unnatural, jerky, as if it were a puppet pulled on invisible strings. The more it moved, the more I could see, but it didn't help. It made it worse. The figure was wearing a mask. No, not a mask. Its face was wrong. It was too smooth, too pale, like the skin had been stretched too tightly over the skull. I gasped, stumbling backward. My mind screamed at me to run, but I couldn't. My legs wouldn't move. I was paralyzed, trapped in my own body as the figure came closer. "Don't look away." That voice, the voice that wasn't mine, whispered in my mind. It wasn't a real voice. It was like a thought, a suggestion, and yet I could hear it so clearly. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the figure as it moved down the hall, its movements growing quicker, more erratic. It was coming for me. I turned to slam the door shut, but my hand froze on the doorknob. Something was wrong. The door, it wasn't the same. It felt wrong. Like it was no longer part of the apartment. Like it was a barrier between me and whatever waited out there. And then I realized something else. The messages, they weren't just reaching out to me. They were pulling me in. I closed my eyes, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The knocking was back, louder this time. Not from the door, but from within the walls. The walls that seemed to close in on me, pressing tighter and tighter as the figure approached. "Open the door," the message flashed again on my phone. But I couldn't. I had already opened it. And what I saw on the other side wasn't supposed to be there. It wasn't supposed to exist. And it was coming for me. I was trapped. The figure was closer now. I could hear its footsteps, slow, deliberate, but they weren't right. Each step seemed to echo inside my mind as much as it did in the hall. I forced myself to move, my body fighting against my will, my legs heavy, unwilling to comply. The walls around me felt like they were inching inward, the air growing thicker, more oppressive. I had to run. I had to get away. But where? The apartment, no, the entire building felt like it was closing in on me. The windows, the walls, even the ceiling seemed to shift as though they were breathing in time with the thing in the hall. The tapping noise had stopped, but I could feel it, something was coming. I turned around, my back to the door, my eyes darting across the room, searching for something, anything, to keep me from going insane. There was a mirror hanging on the wall opposite me. I hadn't noticed it before, but now I couldn't look away from it. It felt like the reflection in the glass wasn't quite mine. No, it was mine, but there was something wrong with it. My face seemed distorted, stretched, like it was pulling away from itself. And then, in the corner of the reflection, just behind me, a shadow appeared. I whirled around. Nothing. There was no shadow. No figure. Just the hallway, empty and quiet, as if nothing had ever happened. I turned back to the mirror, my heart racing. There was no shadow in the reflection. But the feeling of being watched, it was still there. And then, just as my mind was starting to unravel completely, the phone buzzed again. "You're still here." I stared at the message, frozen in place. How could this be happening? I had seen the figure. I had heard it moving. And yet, my apartment, my home, was silent now, as though nothing had happened. The feeling of the walls closing and grew stronger. I could hear the air vibrating, the low hum of something just beyond my comprehension. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. I had to do something. I had to leave. The idea came to me like a desperate impulse. I had to escape the building, get out, away from whatever was happening here. But my legs felt like they were made of lead. Every step I took seemed to get heavier. And then, the knock. Once again, it came from the door, louder this time, almost like it was right behind me. A rapid pounding, a call to action. It was urging me to turn around, to answer. But I knew better now. I couldn't go near that door. I ran toward the window, but the tapping came again. A loud, forceful knock, followed by the sound of the door creaking open just slightly. I spun around, panic rising in my chest. It was no longer just the knocking that unsettled me. It was the fact that the door opened. The door creaked open on its own. No one was there. But then I heard it. A faint whisper, barely audible at first, like it was carried on the wind. "Come outside." The voice was not my own. It was deeper, distorted, like it was coming from a place that didn't belong. I couldn't place where it was coming from, just that it was there, surrounding me, pressing on me from every direction. I backed away from the door, my heart thumping in my chest. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't understand how any of this was real. Was I losing my mind? Was this all just a nightmare? No. It couldn't be a dream. This was real. I could feel it. I looked around the room for an escape. My eyes landed on the hallway, the dark, empty stretch that seemed to pull me in like a void. That was it. I had to get out. The window. I had to open the window and climb out. I didn't care if it was dangerous. I didn't care if it made no sense. There was only one way to escape the nightmare, and it was through that window. I rushed toward it, yanking the blinds open with frantic energy. But when I looked out, I froze. The streets below were empty. The familiar view of the city, the one I'd seen 100 times, was gone. Instead, I saw nothing. Just a black void stretching out beyond the apartment. There were no cars, no people, no sounds. It was as if the city had disappeared completely, leaving only this abyss behind. I gasped, stumbling backward, my hands shaking. The floor felt uneven beneath my feet, and I realized, with a sickening feeling, that the room was shifting again. The walls seemed to be bending inward, warping, twisting into strange shapes that made no sense. It felt as though the entire building was folding in on itself, like it was no longer just a structure of wood and stone, but something alive. Something alive. I couldn't stay here. There was no escape. There was nowhere to run. I reached for my phone again, my hands slick with sweat, my fingers trembling as I tried to open the messages. The screen was blurry. No, it wasn't blurry. It was vibrating, like the phone was alive, responding to something in the air. "Don't run." The message appeared, clear and unmistakable, as if it had been waiting for me to see it. "We know where you are." I couldn't breathe. My lungs were tight, my vision narrowing as the space around me seemed to close in. The walls were getting closer. The room was shrinking. My hand shot out to the walls, desperate to find something solid, something real. But there was nothing. Everything felt unreal now. Was I losing my mind? The tapping from the door began again. But this time it wasn't just at the door. It was inside the walls. The ceiling. The floor. It was everywhere. a deafening rhythm like it was calling me to answer. Was this it? Was this the end? The door. The door was the only way out. I stepped toward it, my feet dragging. I had no choice now. I had to open it. Whatever waited behind it, I had to face it. Because there was no running from what was already inside. I had to face the truth. I reached for the doorknob again. My fingers trembled as they wrapped around the cold, metal doorknob. The sound of the walls shifting around me seemed to grow louder, the rhythm like a heartbeat pulsing through the room. With each passing second, the weight of the air felt heavier, thick with a presence I couldn't escape. The door, once so familiar, now seemed like the threshold to a completely different world, one that was darker, more distorted than anything I could have imagined. I hesitated. The tapping intensified. It wasn't just coming from the door anymore. It was coming from inside me. My own pulse, my own heartbeat, seemed to join in. As if the building was alive, the entire structure pulsating with something malevolent. Something waiting for me to open the door. Do I really want to know what's behind it? A voice, my own, but not my own, whispered inside my mind. The fear gripped me tighter than the chill in my hands. But there was no turning back. I had to know. With a deep breath, I twisted the doorknob. The door creaked open slowly, reluctantly. It felt like I was being pulled through the air, each movement more unnatural than the last. The darkness beyond the door seemed to stretch, as if it had no end. The hallway, if you could still call it a hallway, was not what it should have been. The walls were covered in blackened streaks, like burn marks, but they weren't from fire. The ceiling seemed to sag, bending as if the very building was decaying under an invisible weight. There was no light at the end of the hallway. Only shadows. And the deeper I looked into that darkness, the more it seemed to look back. I stepped forward, my legs shaking, forcing myself to move even though every instinct screamed at me to turn and run. But where would I go? The apartment, my apartment, was already slipping through my fingers. The world outside the window had disappeared. This hallway, this place, was all that was left. The walls seemed to close in as I walked. I couldn't remember the last time I had turned on a light, but the hallway was darker than any night I had ever known. It felt wrong, too quiet, too still. The air was thick with the scent of something foul, like mildew, mixed with a faint metallic tang. Suddenly, I stopped. I felt something behind me, and for a moment, I thought I could hear breathing, heavy, labored breaths. Not mine. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I spun around, expecting to see the thing from the hallway, the figure that had been following me. But no one was there. Still, I felt its presence. The weight of it pressing down on me. Stop, I whispered to myself, but my voice was barely audible, swallowed up by the oppressive silence. It's just in your head. It's just your mind playing tricks on you. I took another step. And then another. The darkness ahead seemed to shift. I thought I saw something move, a shadow, maybe a figure, but when I blinked, it was gone. I was losing my grip on reality. Every corner I turned, every flicker in my peripheral vision made my heart race. My phone buzzed again, a sudden jolt that snapped me out of my thoughts. I pulled it from my pocket with shaking hands. You shouldn't have opened the door. The message was from an unknown number. The words were simple, but they hit me like a punch to the gut. The voice from the message, it sounded so calm, but there was something about it that sent a chill through me. I could almost hear it in my mind, a voice that wasn't mine. We know what you've done. I stared at the screen, my heart hammering in my chest. What had I done? What was happening to me? The message made no sense. Who was this? I stumbled backward, my feet skidding on the floor. But then, before I could gather myself, I heard it again, footsteps, slow, deliberate, coming closer. I whipped around, but the hallway was empty. Still, the steps continued, echoing off the walls, louder now. I took off running, my pulse pounding in my ears. I wasn't sure where I was going. I didn't know if I could get away. The only thing that mattered was the sound of the footsteps, growing louder with every passing second. It was like a force was chasing me, but no matter how fast I ran, it never seemed to get any further away. The hallway stretched out before me, endlessly long, like I was running in circles. I couldn't stop. I couldn't breathe. My mind was screaming at me to wake up, to realize this wasn't real, but the pain in my chest, the panic, it was too real. I looked at my phone again. You're running out of time. I stopped dead in my tracks. The message was too precise. Too perfect. How could they know? Suddenly, the walls began to shift again. The floor beneath my feet groaned, and the air seemed to vibrate with a low hum. I could hear whispers now, soft, unintelligible at first, but then clearer, louder. It was my name. Over and over again. Daniel. It felt like the walls themselves were calling me. My name echoed around me, as if the very building was alive, feeding off my fear. The whispers were getting louder, more insistent, until it felt like they were right next to me. I could feel something cold against the back of my neck, like a breath, but when I turned, no one was there. Daniel, come home. I froze. That wasn't my voice. It wasn't anyone's voice. The words, come home, they pierced through me, deeper than any fear I had felt before. I didn't belong here. I wasn't supposed to be here. I had to get out. But the hallway, the whole building, was closing in on me. There was nowhere to run anymore. The only choice I had was to face whatever was waiting for me. The truth. The thing I had been avoiding. What have I done? I could feel the walls pressing in from all sides, the darkness swallowing everything. The room, the building, everything was collapsing into itself. The phone buzzed again. It's too late to leave. And then, all at once, the darkness was gone. I often find myself wondering if what I see is real. But if it's not, why do I feel the chill down my spine every time they appear? The evening air is heavy, as it always is when the sun starts dipping behind the horizon. The neighborhood is quiet, but not the kind of quiet that gives you peace. It's the kind of quiet that feels off. I live in a house at the end of the street, a place that's seen better days. The house creaks and groans with every breeze, and the yard is overgrown with weeds. I don't mind it much, it's been like this for years, and there's something comforting about the familiar disrepair. Every night, without fail, they come. At first, it was easy to dismiss. A group of children, no older than 10 or 11, running around in the yard. Playing games. Laughing. But as I watched them from the window, I realized something wasn't quite right. The laughter wasn't loud, it was hollow, distant. They never looked up at me, even when I was standing right at the window. Their movements were too precise, like they were following an invisible script. I would blink, and they would be in a different part of the yard, still playing, but always distant. I told myself I was imagining things. After all, it was dark outside, and the shadows could make tricks of the light. But then the oddities started piling up. The first time it happened, I stepped outside to get a closer look. I was halfway across the yard when I noticed them standing near the tree at the far end. They were facing me, but their eyes empty, hollow, like they were seeing something I couldn't, never blinked. I called out, asked if they needed help, but they didn't respond. Not a word. They just kept staring. I took a step closer, and the air around me shifted. It felt colder. My breath hitched in my chest, as if the atmosphere itself was pressing in on me. I blinked, and when I opened my eyes again, they were gone. Vanished. Not even the sound of their footsteps remained. It was as if they had never been there. I've tried to ignore it, but I can't. Every evening, when the sky darkens, they're there. A group of them, sometimes 6, sometimes more, always in the same place. Always staring. Always waiting. I know they see me. I can feel it. The way their eyes never leave me, never blink, as if they're measuring me. Waiting for something. But what? I thought calling someone, the police maybe, but what would I say? That I see children in my yard who don't speak, who disappear when I get close. No one would believe me. They would think I'm losing my mind. Still, tonight is different. Tonight, as I sit in the dim light of my kitchen, the familiar weight of anxiety settles in my chest. The clock ticks slowly, and I know it's almost time. I don't want to go outside, but I can't stop myself. My legs move, and before I know it, I'm standing at the window, watching them. They're already there, just like every other night. But tonight, something is different. Their faces, they're more distinct now, clearer than ever before. I can see them properly, and the realization sends a shiver down my spine. One of the children, the smallest one, is holding something in his hand. It's too dark to see what it is, but I feel the urge to get closer, to know. I step outside, my heart hammering in my chest. As I approach the tree, the air thickens, the shadows deepen. I can barely see the yard now, just the silhouette of the children standing near the trunk, unmoving. The small one with the object still hasn't looked at me. I swallow hard, my throat dry. Hey! I call, my voice shaking. But they don't respond. Not even a flicker. I reach out, just a few more steps away. That's when I hear it. A soft, almost imperceptible whisper, like wind rustling through leaves, but there's no wind. No sound but this one voice. It isn't a word, it's just a sound, like a beckoning. I stop in my tracks, my breath caught in my throat. The child with the object in his hand turns to face me, and his eyes. They are wide, almost unnaturally so, as though they were never meant to hold such size. And the object. I finally see it clearly. It's a small, broken doll. The head is cracked, the face disfigured. I feel my stomach twist as I look at it, and my mind struggles to understand why it feels so wrong. Then, as if on cue, they all turn towards me. Slowly, all at once. The way they move, it's not natural. It's like their bodies bend in strange ways, too rigid, too precise. I feel the weight of their gaze on me, their eyes boring into me. Then they start to move closer, one by one, gliding across the yard. Their feet don't seem to touch the ground, and with every step, the air grows heavier. I freeze. The smallest one reaches out a hand, and I swear I can feel the cold emanating from it, even from this distance. I want to scream, but no sound comes out. My legs move before I can think, and I'm running, turning back only once to see their faces, still staring, still watching. But now, they're all gone. I stand in the yard, gasping for air, not knowing if what just happened was real. But I feel it. The chill in the air, the weight of their eyes on me. They're still out there, watching, waiting, and I can't stop them. The real question is, why are they here? I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I had barely closed the door behind me when the first wave of cold hit, wrapping around me like a fog, as if the house itself was reacting to the darkness outside. But I couldn't bring myself to look out the window again. I knew they were out there, watching, waiting. I felt the weight of my own body pressing against the walls of the house. It was a familiar weight. The house, the creaky floors, the worn-out furniture. But tonight, it felt different. It was as if the very air inside had changed. The silence was too loud. Every sound, every shift of the floorboards beneath me seemed amplified, too clear. I could feel something pressing against me, something that wasn't part of the house, but part of me. The hours passed. I tried to distract myself, pick up a book, scroll mindlessly through my phone, but everything felt off. My fingers tapped restlessly on the table as I stared at the screen. The same silence. The same unease. It was a trap. I couldn't get away from it. Suddenly, a sound broke the stillness, a soft tap, tap, tap. I froze. It came from the window. I turned slowly, too slowly, as if my own body was betraying me. The light from the street lamp outside barely reached the window, casting a faint, ghostly glow. I stared at it, feeling the panic build inside me. Tap, tap, tap. I didn't want to look. I knew what I'd see. But the sound, it was relentless. Slowly, my legs carried me toward the window. My heart thudded in my chest. I reached for the curtain. My hand trembled as I pulled it aside. And there they were, standing in my yard. All of them. Their faces, their eyes, it was worse than before. They weren't just staring now. They were looking straight at me with a familiarity that sent chills down my spine. As if they knew something I didn't. Something I had forgotten. The smallest one, the one with the broken doll, was standing right in the middle. His head tilted slightly to one side, and I could see the doll in his hand. The cracked head, the empty eyes. It was the same one, but now it was more than just a doll. It felt like it was alive, like it was watching me too. The air seemed to freeze in place. My heart skipped a beat, and I could feel the sweat trickling down the back of my neck. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. And then, just as quickly as it had started, they disappeared. Vanished into the darkness, as though they had never been there. I stood in front of the window, my chest heaving, unsure of what had just happened. Had I imagined it? Had it all been a dream? But the cold feeling, the unsettling weight of their presence, it lingered. I backed away from the window, my mind racing. I couldn't stay here. I had to leave, had to get away from this. From them. But no matter where I went, I knew they would find me. They always did. I ran to the door and threw it open, stepping out into the night air. The yard was empty, just as I had hoped. I stood there, breathing in the cool night, trying to calm the shaking in my limbs. But then, I heard it again. The sound of footsteps. I turned quickly, but there was nothing there. Nothing but shadows. And yet, I could feel them. The children. Their eyes. Their presence. It was like they were inside my mind, in my thoughts, creeping into every corner of my consciousness. I couldn't escape. Not from them. Not from the feeling that something far darker was pulling the strings. That they weren't just children. They were something else. Something I wasn't meant to understand. I ran. I don't know how long I ran for, through the empty streets, the cold wind cutting into my skin. I kept my eyes forward, never looking back. The sound of their footsteps echoed in my head, even though I knew they weren't really there. They were in my mind. I had to get away. I didn't stop until I reached the old park on the outskirts of the neighborhood. The swing set creaked in the wind. The trees whispered with each gust. But the air here felt different. Lighter. More normal. I collapsed onto a bench, gasping for breath, trying to regain control. I told myself I had to stay calm. I had to make sense of this. But just as I was about to get up, to leave and figure out what to do next, I heard it. A voice. Soft. Whispers. Come back. It was faint, but unmistakable. The children's voices. From the shadows around me. I turned quickly, but again, no one was there. Just the darkness stretching out before me. And then I felt it. A cold hand. A breath on the back of my neck. I was no longer alone. The breath on the back of my neck was too real. Too close. My heart lurched in my chest, and I spun around, my eyes desperately searching the darkness. But there was nothing. No one. Just the wind rustling through the trees, whispering secrets I couldn't understand. But it felt wrong. The air felt thick, oppressive, as if the world around me was holding its breath, waiting for something. For me to move. To make the wrong move. I didn't. I couldn't. My legs were frozen, my body betraying me. Every fiber of my being screamed to run, to escape, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from the shadows. The darkness seemed to stretch in all directions, pulling at me, drawing me deeper into its cold embrace. The whispers returned, louder this time, echoing through the park. Not just one voice, but many. The children. I could hear them clearly now, their words becoming sharper, more distinct. Come back, it's not over. Come play with us. The words drilled into my skull, seeping into every corner of my mind. I could feel their presence now, closer than ever. They were all around me, just beyond my vision. But when I turned, I saw nothing. Just the empty park, the dark trees, the empty swings swaying in the wind. Then, a noise, soft, faint, but unmistakable, came from the ground beneath me. The earth seemed to shift, as if something was stirring below, clawing its way upward. My stomach twisted in horror as I realized what was happening. The ground wasn't just shifting. It was alive. I stumbled back, my foot catching on something, an exposed root. The ground was pulling at me, trying to drag me down. Panic surged through me. I tried to move, but the earth was like glue, holding me in place. I reached out, grasping for anything to hold onto, but my fingers scraped against something cold. Something wet. I looked down, my breath catching in my throat. The children's faces. They were there, imprinted in the soil. Their hollow eyes staring up at me, their mouths twisted in grotesque smiles. I felt their eyes bore into me, felt their fingers reach for me, clawing at my skin, dragging me closer to the earth. I screamed. I couldn't stop it. My hands clawed at the ground, trying to pull myself free, but it was useless. The earth was pulling me down. The whispers grew louder, closer. You should have never come back. And then, through the chaos, I saw it. A figure. Tall. Dark. Standing at the edge of the park. Watching. Waiting. I didn't recognize it, but I knew, deep down, it was the thing that had been controlling them. The thing that had brought them here. The thing that had been pulling the strings all along. It moved toward me, slow and deliberate, its shadow swallowing the light of the park. Its shape shifted, distorted, like something that wasn't meant to be seen. Its presence felt like a weight pressing on my chest, suffocating me. I tried to scream again, but the words stuck in my throat. I was too scared. Too weak. The figure was right there now, close enough to touch. And then, with a soft, guttural whisper, it spoke. Time to go home. And just like that, I was falling. Falling through the earth, through the dark, endless void. The last thing I heard was the children's laughter. Soft at first, but growing louder. Louder. Until it filled my entire world. And then, silence. I woke up to the sound of birds chirping. The sun was high in the sky, casting a warm, golden glow over everything. I blinked, confused, disoriented. My body ached. My mind was clouded with fragments of memories, flashes of something unreal. I was in my room. My bed. My familiar surroundings. But it didn't feel right. I stood up, my legs shaky, and walked to the window. The park was gone. The trees, the swings, the shadows, none of it was there. The world outside was calm, peaceful. Too peaceful. I reached for my phone, instinctively. My hands trembled as I unlocked it. The screen flickered to life. I scrolled through my messages, my heart pounding in my chest. And then I saw it. A message. From a number I didn't recognize. It was simple. Welcome back. I froze. And then I heard it. A knock on my door. Soft. Insistent. I knew it was them. Thank you for making our stories part of your relaxation time. We hope they brought you a sense of peace and transported you to a world of fantasy and mystery. If you enjoyed the stories, feel free to leave us a review. Your feedback inspires us and helps us make the content even better. Now, unwind to the calming sounds of rain and thunderstorms, which will continue to set a tranquil mood. Let these sounds carry you gently into the realm of dreams. Don't forget to like our page if you haven't yet. Wishing you a restful night's sleep. Relax, rest well, and good night.